listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the biggest political show on the planet. 1.2 million viewers of last week's mother of all talk shows. A quite remarkable achievement. The biggest audience in the 15 years that this show has been running. A remarkable achievement for which I thank each and every one of you. A remarkable week in Washington, even by Donald Trump's Washington standards. Not only did the Manhattan Mauler manhandle the Delaware Doltard, almost to the point of the white towel being thrown in, it would be white, of course, to save sleepy Joe Biden, who was almost KO'd. Then Donald Trump fell over, got helicoptered in to the Walter Reed Hospital with coronavirus that he claimed originally was a hoax, and then that it would go away in the warm weather. And as we now head into the autumn, there he is in hospital. But oh no, actually he's coming out tomorrow. He went in on a helicopter on Friday, but he's walking out on Monday. What's going on in Washington? Anya Parampil certainly knows, and she's up first as our guest from the United States. And it's war in the Caucasus between the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave of Armenian people and the Azerbaijan armed forces backed by Turkey and by the Syrian jihadists. What could possibly go wrong? Well, war between Russia and Turkey, just for starters. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's a radio show with pictures. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London, but coming to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet, courtesy of SputnikNews.com. And if you are listening in the Washington, D.C. area, 105.5 are the magic numbers there. And you can get it on FM and on AM from Burning City to Burning City, right across the United States of America. If you're watching on Facebook, either on my Facebook page or on RT's multiple Facebook platforms, please share with all of your friends, because that phenomenal audience I just told you about has to be maintained. 1 million is the least I'm going to accept from now on. It was the best audience that we've had in the 15 years that this show has been running across various platforms. But stand by. My good wife, Gayatri, is in the room. Well, we couldn't afford to pay anyone to do this, so she kindly volunteered. But she has a very, very important set of housekeeping announcements to make about the launch of Moats Extra, a midweek show on a Wednesday, which starts in 10 days' time. That's Wednesday, the 14th of October at 8 p.m. London time. For as long as I've been doing this show, people have been saying once a week just isn't enough. So by popular demand, Gayatri, almost entirely on her own, but not absolutely on her own, has put together Moats Extra. Tell us about it, please.
Well, it's very simple. It's mother of all talk shows, the show that people love. George Galloway, but bare-knuckled.
Bare-knuckled, she said. Don't get that wrong. Bare-knuckled, as in hard-hitting, no gloves.
No, it's going to be
hard-hitting, gloves off, bloody, and yes, be ready for it, really.
Yeah, I mean, it will it will have some ferocious debate on it. And I'm the conspiracy theorist par excellence. So the first show, we hope to have Richard Gage, the head of 9/11 architects and engineers. We'll have people on the Kennedy story. We'll be diving deep.
All kinds.
We'll be diving deep into historical and also political issues. UFOs.
We'll have music as well.
And we'll
This
have
is the
music.
extra, right?
Music like we used to have in the old TalkSport days.
The old days,
And
yeah.
some of those tracks too, because my musical taste hasn't really moved on. So you can prepare yourself for the return of the Top Cat. Now, how do people do this, Gayatri?
Right, so there are two ways. The first one is through Facebook, your Facebook page, which is George Galloway Official. And with 10 days to go, we're starting the countdown. I'm going to press this button, create event, and then the people can start.
That's it now, that's it live.
There you go.
So people can register right now.
Yeah, they can start registering. They can start registering and reserving their seats for 10 days to come.
And on Patreon,
The second way is through Patreon. And
that's the best way.
because then you just subscribe and you'll never miss a show. It's $5 a month, and you get extras. You get
That's $5 US.
$5.
Yeah.
It's because you subscribe, you get some extras. You're going to get behind the scenes before and after the show, which can be bloody as well.
Yeah, yeah. You can catch me buttoning up my shirt.
Yes, and more. And then for the early birds, you've got a 500 special gift for them.
Yeah, a historic Moats souvenir to mark the launch.
Yeah, so
of the,
they can.
So that's the first 500 to subscribe on Patreon.
That's www.patreon.com/George Galloway, and
That's
it. You just
that's
select-
simple,
Yeah.
and there it is, by the way, up on the screen.
There you go.
So Facebook, George Galloway Official, or on my Patreon. That's patreon.com//George Galloway, and it starts. Remind everyone.
Wednesday, 14th of October. That's 10 days to go. We're starting the countdown now. 10 days to go.
Thank you
That's
very
it.
much indeed, Gayatri. We have a very young baby, aged 8 weeks this weekend, to whom Gayatri must now speedily return. But as I said in the introduction, this phenomenal audience of 1.2 million is all thanks to RT and to SputnikNews.com. If not for Sputnik, if not for RT, this show would have disappeared last year. They rescued it and they built it into a worldwide phenomenon. And I will always be grateful to them for that. And this show will continue every Sunday forever, as long as God gives me breath. That I can guarantee you. This is the mothership on RT and on SputnikNews.com. So you can watch on Facebook, you can watch on YouTube, you can watch on Twitter, you can even watch on Instagram, you can watch on Twitch. You know the drill, as Joe Biden might say, although not quite so eloquently. Speaking of Joe Biden and his rival, Donald Trump, the Manhattan Mauler that broke every rule, every piece of politesse, of manners, decency in a debate was broken by the Manhattan Mauler in Cleveland earlier last week. Joe Biden, though, looked to be a feeble and frail and lost old man. And that's despite having something in his ear where somebody told him where he was, what day it was, what office he was running for, and what he should say. And despite all that, he looked like Floyd Patterson in the ring with Mike Tyson. But Mike Tyson without the class in Donald Trump's case. It was a stairhead brawl. It was a barroom stramash. Nobody yet knows what the impact of it would have played out as, because no sooner had it finished, and therein lies a potential tale, Donald Trump was diagnosed as being positive to the COVID-19 epidemic. The one that he said originally was a hoax. the one that he said would disappear. The one that he said would disappear when the weather got warm. That was last February and March. Well, it's been warm and it's getting colder again. And not only has it not disappeared, it's now hospitalized him. He said that you might be able to treat it with sunlight, maybe even inject sunlight somehow, disinfectant somehow. But none of that was relied upon by him in the Walter Reed Memorial Hospital in Washington. He got basically a mixture of the Chinese and Cuban treatment for the coronavirus, which is, of course, the greatest of ironies, because he won't let anyone else in the United States get that treatment. And indeed, most Western governments are doing everything that they can to make sure that no politically inconvenient source of a vaccine or a treatment for the coronavirus makes it through, so that the big multinational drug companies get the gig, if indeed they can ever come up with the goods, which is questionable in my opinion. I told you last week I have asked the Russian ambassador if I can have the Sputnik 5 Russian vaccine. I'll even take it live on air on the show. I'm still waiting for the necessary permissions to come through to have that, because I trust the Russian doctors in a way that I would not trust the big multinational drug companies who are producing whatever they're producing entirely for the profit, entirely for the fiscal achievement of their shareholders and their well-remunerated directors. I'd rather go with Russia or Cuba or China, and I'll take the vaccine from any of them. And indeed, as I said, even live on air. But the big question is, if Donald Trump really is, as I've just been told, going to walk out of the hospital tomorrow, that's a very puzzling hospitalization indeed. It was confirmed that he was given oxygen on Friday, so he was given oxygen on Friday, but is fit to walk out on Monday. Well, that really is a miracle. It's one that he should share with all the other millions of people so similarly stricken all over the world. I hope that he will do that. I hope that Donald Trump has learned his lesson about the coronavirus, and I hope it can lead to a coming together, a committee of the peoples of the world, so that we can fight this pandemic together, instead of fighting wars alongside it, instead of trade wars alongside it, embargoes, quarantines, sieges alongside it, as well as, or rather instead of the war of perpetual words, a bedlam, a din of hate coming from capitals against other capitals. But what will the impact be on the presidential election? Will this boost Donald Trump, or will it harm him? Will he now look frail, as frail perhaps even as Joe Biden? Is this the battle of the gerontocrats? Is this the battle of the Zimmer frames? Is this the battle of the men with carers? Is this the battle of the men who can't stand up straight? And what does that tell us about the state of United States empire, if it is? We'll be talking to my good friend Anya Parampil, top journalist at the Grey Zone Project, about all things Americana during the first hour of the show. But you know that if there's a war going on, we will be the ones properly to cover it. And that's why in the second hour, we have the intrepid war reporter, star war reporter Murad Gazdiev from RT, who's in the zone where cluster bombs are being dropped on cities, where all forms of war have been unleashed from the air and from the ground. A war that has now involved openly Turkey, President Erdogan, who has pledged his troth to the Azerbaijan government in crushing Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an enclave of Armenian people inside Azerbaijan, which for many years past has had its autonomy, and that autonomy was won in an ugly way with the purging of Azerbaijani people, civilian people, from the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. But we cannot have Turks promising a final solution for Armenians because we've been down that road before. We have seen the genocidal attack on the Armenian people over 100 years ago, no doubt, but still vivid in the historical memory of all Armenians and their friends all over the world. And they have many friends all over the world. We have to avoid this conflict spiraling out of control, spiraling into a Muslim versus Christian armed conflict, spiraling into a Turkey versus Russia armed conflict. Because, of course, in the end, Russia is the guarantor of Armenia, of its security. It has a treaty with Armenia. If Armenia is attacked, Russia must come to her defense. And we must avoid that. A war between Turkey and Russia would, of course, be a war between NATO and Russia in the Caucasus, on top of the oil fields. What could possibly go wrong? This war, as I tipped you off about last week, is deadly serious, and it's getting more serious by the minute. And we will give it the attention in this show this evening that it thoroughly deserves. And of course, finally, and running through all of these stories, because of course, if there's a war in the Caucasus, on top of collapsing economies throughout the world, and on top of a pandemic which has killed 1 million people so far, then we'll be compounding misery upon misery upon misery, and we must stop it. And when will someone get to grips with the coronavirus? I can't speak of other people's countries with any great exactitude, but I can speak about my own. Most people in Britain no longer understand the regulations in place in our country, not least because there are multiple different regulations applying to our citizens. I don't just refer to the different scheme in Wales, the quite different scheme in Scotland, the different scheme in England, but now regional schemes and regulations in different parts of all of these countries. And nobody any longer knows with any real confidence what these regulations are for, what they are achieving, what the opportunity cost of them is in terms of health outcomes for people with other ailments, other problems, other often desperate and indeed life-threatening needs. We no longer have confidence in our Prime Minister's ability to steer us through these troubled waters. At least I don't. You can let me know if you disagree. Still less have we got confidence in these jokers that pop up as experts at the podium in Downing Street, panicking the population, terrifying them with the possibility of exponential, multiplication, growth of cases, which hasn't happened, might yet, but hasn't happened. In other words, it's a dog's breakfast. And I, for one, believe that it's time that we appoint a COVID czar in this country. Somebody with credibility on all sides of the argument. Someone who's not a doctor. If war is too important to be left to generals, then big policy decisions are too important to be left to doctors. But neither someone who's a politician, because partisan politics will be suspected in anything that she or he says or decides. But I'm a believer that the buck has to stop somewhere, and that our bucks are being scattered everywhere and to little effect. So I'm calling, and I'll put this to the Moats medic, Dr. Ranjeet Brar, in the third hour of the show, for a big shake-up in Britain's response to the coronavirus. You tell me what you think. We've got a poll running. What will be the impact of President Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis? Will he, A, admit it's serious, B, make a miracle recovery, C, remain president for the rest of his life, which is a double meaning, dear folks. You can vote on my Twitter feed, @George Galloway, on that. After this 60-second break, it's my good friend, Anya Parampil, from the United States of America. Stay tuned. Call me. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Don't bring up a false name. Come on air. Call me and let's have this matter out.
Let's get ready to rumble!
How have you got the nerve to tell people to Brexit if you're not telling them the repercussions?
That's 2016's argument, Michael. I'm no longer arguing with you about the merits of Brexit. I'm arguing with you about democracy, about the right of the majority to have their decision, their vote implemented.
This match will get red hot.
Not have a referendum. Let them have a referendum. Let them sort it out amongst themselves.
I want a referendum. Robert, I want a referendum. Let me put that in capital letters. If you think this year of 2020, which is shaping up already to be an annus miserabilis for the SNP, if you think this is your year, go ahead. Come on. Let's have it out.
It's on.
But no, George, it's not as simple as that, right? Have you seen the documentary about Cambridge Analytica and the people who work there? Have you looked at the global
I know nothing about them. I'm not interested in them.
Precisely. But
I'm not interested. I'm not interested in them, Bruce, because it's all a red herring. Just like Russiagate was a red herring.
You're up.
Do you only want to hear voices that agree with you? Because if you do, you're not clever enough to be at this open university of the airwaves. In fact, you need to go back to remedial and learn something about what democracy and freedom of speech actually mean.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Don't forget that poll, it's quite important. What will the impact of President Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis be? A, will he admit it's serious? B, will he make a miracle recovery? C, will he have turned out to be president for the rest of his life? I've got a lot of responses to it already. James says Trump needed to get his tax returns and white supremacy out of the headlines and succeeded, since journalists and Twitterites are not that intelligent. And Filza says he will blame China for this and not his own carelessness. And Ashley says, do you think it's real or is it just a trick to win votes? There are too many suspicions. Well, let's ask that very question of my guest and good friend, Anya Parampil, journalist on the Grey Zone Project and in her own right on many different platforms also. Anya, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Wonderful to see you again. Let's start with that question. Do you think it's real?
It's always nice to speak with you, George, from across the pond here in Washington, D.C. I do believe this is real. I think it's been very fascinating to see the liberal class in the United States unsure. They're torn between wanting to accuse the president of fabricating this diagnosis and of pulling this stunt in order to not only bring attention away from headlines such as the one your responder on the poll on Twitter said, such as white supremacists, but also in order to gain sympathy among the public. And I just don't think, well, they're torn between that theory, and then the other side of the liberal class is also claiming that the president's hiding his true condition and that he's much sicker than he's letting on. And I don't think it makes sense that the president would lie about this, or that the staff of the White House, the medical staff, would lie to that level. And we've seen several other individuals, including Senator Chris Christie, members of the Trump campaign and White House team, also diagnosed. It's a pretty big operation. And it's funny that liberals are allowed to be conspiracists out in the open, such as this, saying, oh, the president is making this up, it's a big lie. But I, for one, don't believe that, for example, the president would want to get out of future debates. While many say that he lost last week's debate against Democratic candidate Biden, that's very typical of incumbent presidents. They're not generally the ones who perform very well during those debates. And I don't think Trump himself sees himself as a loser. He thinks he did well, and he loves debates. He loves that engagement. He's betting on Biden not performing as well in the future. But most importantly, the president wouldn't want to give up all of this important campaign time. He loves being on the trail. He's pretty much been campaigning for re-election since the start of his presidency, visiting swing states, out speaking to crowds in a way that Biden certainly has not.
He can draw a crowd.
He can draw. The president still can in many of these states. And we have 30 days until the election here in the United States. This is a crucial period. I just don't believe the president would be making this up. It's a little bit ridiculous, I think, to see people accusing him of that. And
well, especially, isn't it paradoxical because the same liberals are stirred and shaken at the possibility of a confirmation of Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, and are exulting in the fact that at least 2 Republican senators are also now positive for coronavirus and may not even be allowed to enter Washington, D.C., still less the capital, to vote for that nominee, in which case she would very well fail. So either the Republicans are making this up or they're not making it up, and they're going to lose the opportunity of a successful nomination to the Supreme Court.
I don't think they would take that kind of risk, and I don't think the president necessarily gains anything politically from this illness. I misspoke earlier, by the way. I believe I said Senator Chris Christie. I meant governor. He's the former governor of New Jersey.
Has he also got it?
Yes. Yes, and he's checked himself into a hospital. This is precautionary. But you have right now complete and utter speculation, and this is something that I would be interested in comparing with the situation in the UK when politicians, and including your prime minister have been diagnosed with COVID-19. The one issue here that I see as a legitimate criticism, a major legitimate criticism of the White House at this moment, is that there's conflicting information. There's not real information coming out about the state of the president, which is leading to really, I think, nasty speculation on behalf of the media. You have MSNBC out there saying that because he's on certain medications, this means that he's doing much worse than the White House is claiming. I think there is definitely a feeling among some of these reporters and hosts that have spent the last 4 years railing against the president that they would like him to be very sick and perhaps pass away. But then the other side of it's revealing so much really about the liberal class, because not only are they in some ways engaging in this nasty speculation, they've spent the last 4 years telling us the president was a puppet of a foreign country. Now, more recently, they've been claiming that he's not going to leave office, that he's not going to accept the results of the election, that he's essentially Hitler in the making, leading and calling for support from white supremacist gangs. And then the minute he's ill, they say, well, we want him to recover so we can beat him at the ballot box. And it's just this, you can't really believe that they believe that they're taking seriously these claims they're making about the president if that's their line. It just shows you that they're, I think, really most of the time engaging in cynical partisan politics. And now some are openly even speculating about the president's health.
Yeah, and some of the most exotic liberals are openly and publicly wishing the president dead, the kind of thing that if he were to do about his enemies, they would be out on the streets in their pussy hats protesting about, calling him every name under the sun. Let's have a working hypothesis that he does, as I've just been told on the news here, leave hospital tomorrow, which is a miracle recovery for sure. What impact then do you think this is going to have on the dynamic of the election campaign?
It really depends on how the president decides to use it. I think one of the tweeters who responded to your poll had a pretty good theory that he might use it to just escalate rhetoric against China. That's what he's done every time there is major news regarding COVID-19 in the media. He speaks about how this is China's fault, and I can see him blaming China for getting him sick. An
assassination attempt.
I mean, you never know how far he's going to go with that kind of rhetoric. Yeah. But my fantasy would be that he emerges from this saying all U.S. citizens deserve health care. This was an experience that taught me how much I value healthcare workers, and so I'm going to run on a campaign for Medicare for all or single-payer health care. I don't think that's going to happen. If he did, I think he would have a good chance of winning. But it really, I'm always hesitant to make predictions about the president's behavior. I don't think he's really going to emerge from this, though, and say, oh, I was wrong about COVID this whole time. I think he'll say something along the lines of, it was difficult, but we beat it, and here I am. He's not in the greatest shape. He's an older individual. He's 74 years old. So if he recovers in 3 or 4 days, he could even say that it supports his theories that it's nothing worse than the flu. But we'll see. And it's never fun to predict. I just saw, though, a few minutes ago that there are Trump supporters rallied outside of Walter Reed Hospital, and they're playing "Staying Alive," and it looked kind of like a festive atmosphere.
Well, maybe John Travolta will waltz down the street. And you could tell by the way he walks, he's a Trump man. The Joe Biden campaign, I was very critical in my earlier remarks, and in the short that I did for RT, which comes up right after our conversation, I'll be even more critical. I don't believe that that Trump lost the debate. I know that he scandalized every liberal and salon commentator in the land, indeed the world, with his vulgarity, his lack of manners and politesse. But then, did it play in Peoria is the only real question. And I believe the medium-term effect of the debate and the debates to come would have established at least one thing in the voters' minds: that Trump is strong and powerful, and that Biden is weak and powerless. And if anybody's a puppet, it looks to me like Joe Biden is the puppet of corporate interests, the puppet of the Democratic Party's establishment. No one can. I just saw a video, Anya, in which Joe Biden's lips move and the following words come out: "When I joined the Senate 180 years ago," I'm not making that up, that's what he said on television. I joined the Senate 180 years ago. He thinks he's Abraham Lincoln. He thinks he was at Gettysburg. This man is too weak and powerless to be president. That, to me, would be the lasting effect of a series of debates with Donald Trump. Over to you, your take.
I was surprised, honestly, that Biden did as well as he did last week. I think that's part of why the consensus in the media and in some polls have been that he won. Though I agree with you, in my personal opinion, I don't think it was very cut and dry. I think Trump had a strategy where he was trying to speak over Biden, knowing that he's had some trouble with his mind lately, and scramble him a bit. And somehow Biden didn't have any major gaffes, which we've just become used to every time he opens his mouth during this campaign. So the fact that he didn't have any major slip up, I think, is really what gave him this appearance of performing really well, because the bar was so low. But I also don't know how much of an impact these debates make on the average voter. I forget the exact number, but at this point in the race, most citizens in the United States, most people have made up their minds about who they're going to vote for. And it's just a small group that's really still trying to decide. But with the way things happen in this country, the last month can make a huge difference in swing states. And if the president, again, if he emerges from this COVID and is able to use it to his advantage, then I think a lot of people have written him off, but there's still a good chance that he could win. And if Biden doesn't perform well in the upcoming debates, which I think is a huge possibility, he got so lucky. I don't know how he made it through that last one, but if he doesn't perform as well, and he does have a major gaffe, then the impact can be much greater than him just having a decent performance. If it's getting coverage all the time and it really becomes an issue, which it should be, I think his mental state should really be a question that I don't think the media is taking as seriously as they do for the president. But a lot can change in 30 days. Even though it seems like we have year-long campaigns in the United States, unlike anywhere else in the world. I couldn't have imagined last week at this time that the president would be hospitalized with COVID-19, but it really just feels as though we're living in a bad novel in the United States these days, and I can't guess the ending.
Well, the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson once said, "A week is a long time in politics," and that was long before the social media age. Now a day or 2 days is a long time in politics. Anya Parampil, thank you again for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Always a pleasure to hear your perspective. Now, as I said earlier, I did a short for RT on the debates. Have a look. So that was it, the big fight. The Manhattan Mauler versus the Delaware Doltard. Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. But if that was the big fight, imagine what the undercard must have looked like. Because not since Rocky Marciano fought Don Coquel, and that was a mismatch, I can tell you, has there been a match quite like this. The Mauler came out like Mike Tyson, but without the class. Joe Biden came out like Floyd Patterson or a mouse. One of them is inches from senility. The other is moments from madness. Donald Trump is quite unhinged, but at least he's strong and powerful. Joe Biden was like a very frail and feeble old man, clinging to the shaky handrail of not being Donald Trump, for that can be his only qualification. This is a man who once might have been a contender. That's until he was revealed as a serial plagiarist and liar about his CV, which made him drop out of a presidential campaign in the 1980s. To make matters even worse, he was plagiarizing Neil Kinnock. And if you know anything about Labour leaders, you'll know how low you have to be to plagiarize Neil Kinnock. He lied about what university he was at. He lied about the grades he got at that university. He even plagiarized me once by claiming that he'd been assaulted in a Cape Town police station, though he said it was in Johannesburg, when he was on his way to try and see Nelson Mandela in prison. Mandela was in prison off Cape Town, which was where I was assaulted in a Cape Town police station while I was trying to get in touch with the imprisoned Nelson Mandela. Confused? Well, Joe was. In fact, he had the air of Chance the Gardener, the great Peter Sellers character in Peter Sellers' last film, and arguably his best. Chance was a man who literally wandered onto the set and into the Oval Office. He was an imbecile, but people took his imbecilic remarks for deep philosophical truths. The debate merely allowed Guardian readers all over the world to be shocked and horrified all over again at the ugliness of American empire. Ooh and ah, they shouted, as the vulgarian barroom brawler broke every rule in the book for polite debate and discourse. Joe, on the other hand, scarcely knew where he was. It's my contention that nothing sums up the state of American empire like the fact that the most powerful office in the land is being fought over between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But we all need to be worried because one of these palookas is going to be the President of the United States of America next month. One of these jokers is going to have his finger on the nuclear trigger, a trigger which could very well bring about the very end of humanity, the very destruction of the world. And if that's not a horror movie, I've never seen one. I could never bring myself to vote for either, or to encourage any of you to do so either. My candidate isn't running, but I will not choose between the lesser of two evils. There's two problems with that. I'm not entirely sure which of the two is the lesser evil. But more importantly, if you keep voting for the lesser of two evils, evil always wins.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Let me know if you disagree with that or agree with it, of course, either by calling the show on 02077 982 255 if you're in the UK, or if you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480, or on Twitter, of course, either on my own Twitter feed at George Galloway or at RT UK News. In fact, preferably on both. Now, the poll, what will be the impact of Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis A, will he admit it's serious? 13%. B, make a miracle recovery? 68%. And C, will he turn out to have been president for the rest of his life? 19%. Michael is on the line from South Carolina on the U.S. election. Let's hear him. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George. Great to talk to you again.
Welcome.
Let me say this right off. Trump has always been a bully, but he's always been protected by other people. And like most bullies, he's actually a coward. And you know, that just goes. You can see this when you see that the way he talks about the COVID virus and downplays it and acts like it's nothing but the flu. And then when he ends up testing positive, he runs to the place that has the best possible care that you can get on this planet, probably, you know, for something like this. And this is the same thing that he would deny every other American citizen.
Good point.
And, you know,
Good point. Michael, if I was him, I'd come out of hospital and say, this virus is more serious than I thought it was. And access to good quality healthcare is more important than I have before allowed it to be. And so I am going to declare war on this virus, and I am going to ensure that every single person in America has Medicare for all. If I was Donald Trump, that would be my game-changing moment, and I would use this hospitalization to so declare. Boris Johnson did something like that, didn't live up to it, but Trump's only got to live up to it for 30 more days, and then he's re-elected or not. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And of course, you know, there's something else to consider here. I mean, he went to the hospital immediately after the diagnosis when he first felt he had a symptom, okay? He didn't do like, you know, most other people would do, like quarantine for a while, and then if it got bad, you try to get some treatment. And most people in the United States can't afford to do any of this. But he gets, you know, the very best possible treatments for all of these things. But you know, what I'm saying is it would be nice to see him have a Boris Johnson moment, but you know, that would go against all of the you know, Republican mantra. It would just be
but he needs a game changer, Michael.
That's exactly right, and it would be a great October surprise if he did that. And it's very possible that he could, you know, actually do that. But
well, if he's watching tonight, that's you and me both advising him to do that.
Yeah, but you know, here's the thing also. You know, the average time that it takes for the COVID virus to kill a person is 18 and a half days. He hasn't nearly reached that time yet.
No,
okay,
so unless he had it during the debates, which would be quite damaging for him if that was true.
I don't think it's possible because he gets tested every day, as do all of his inner circle people, and you know they get tested too. So I'm just saying we're not you know, past the point here that we can say that he's making a recovery. But he is getting the best possible care of everybody.
Yeah, but he's desperate to get out. I mean, the reports here anyway are that he's leaving hospital tomorrow. Michael, brilliant call. Thanks for making it. Anthony is in Detroit. On the same subject. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Yeah, it looks like this infection that's making its way through not only the president and his advisors, but now some of the senators. And it looks like, I mean, I don't really know if anyone knows where, but maybe some people...
Well, it's a Republican virus. It's not the Chinese virus. It's the Republican virus.
It looks like that judge's nomination ceremony at the White House was probably a big cause of that spread, maybe.
Yeah.
And the irony of it is that it might be used as the last-ditch effort to buy some time by the Democrats to prevent, you know, a quorum for the committee to consider the judge.
Yeah.
So
well, life is like that. It's called the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. But either way, if they try to push it through, I think it's going to be real unfortunate for our country, honestly.
Presumably, you know, he wants to push it through in case the result of the election ends up in the Supreme Court, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's any number of scenarios that could go that way, and but really the one people are worried about is Obamacare, I guess. But, you know, it affects that. more than anything.
Well, if he takes my advice, he'll trump, if you'll forgive the pun, anything that Obamacare was able to deliver. Anthony in Detroit, thanks very much for that call. On my short, Ed says the only reason Biden is up is because the rest of them are terrified of Trump. Sometimes I think it's a wind-up. Biden is a washout. It's laughable. And Sonia says, I think it's possible Biden was chosen as a candidate by disaffected Republicans who might just vote to get Trump out. Will says, I'm so baffled. How can a so-called rich and powerful country have no proper candidate to become president? It's obvious that intellect has no role to play in America's elections. There's something seriously wrong with their process. And Brian says, got to go down as one of the worst debates ever. Policy was off the table. It was all about opinions, personal pops, etc., instead of substance. Overall, a shambles. Now, some people thought that I was joking about how long Joe Biden has been in the Senate. Some of you doubted whether, as I claimed, he was at Gettysburg. Some of you doubted, as I claimed, that he dodged the draft in the American Civil War also. Take a look at this.
That's why I made it a priority my entire career to work closely with you. From the time I got to the Senate 180 years ago, as well as my tenure as vice president, I got to the Senate 180 years ago,
You see, I wasn't joking. Now, that can't be put down to a misstatement. You might misspeak in a conversation or in a speech, even. He was very clear about it. We showed it you twice. You could play it yourself. As long as I've been in the Senate, since I came into the Senate 180 years ago, that's not a misstatement. That is a madman speaking. That is a man, that's Zelig. That is Zelig, the man that popped up everywhere in the Woody Allen picture, all throughout history. There he was. Well, that's Joe Biden, the Zelig of this presidential debate. Chase is in Texas. Let's hear from him. Chase, great to hear from you again.
It's great to hear you from you too, George.
Go ahead, brother.
So I want to talk about how Twitter suspended Unity 2020 from I think 2 months ago at the end of August. I want to know what your thoughts are.
Who's been suspended?
Unity 2020 by Brett Weinstein and other people.
No, I don't know anything about that. Tell us about it.
Well, I mean, it's actually a group that was made by Brett Weinstein for just to have the people to have their voice and possible a third candidate. But recently, they actually been suspended for no suspicious reason by Twitter. I mean, after all, Twitter is kind of a pro-establishment.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, they'll eliminate anything just to stay the status quo in power.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's their platform. They set the rules on their own platform. We can have our own platforms. This is one of them. We've built it, you and me, and all the other 1.2 million people who last week watched this show. We've got to do it ourselves. We can't expect the platforms owned by people who think profoundly differently to us to give us airtime and a platform forevermore. The day might come when we're all shut down on Twitter. That's why we have to build our own platforms. Chase in Texas, thanks for bringing that to our attention. The hour is racing, so let me go to Shamil in Inverness. Go ahead, Shamil.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Thanks for speaking to me again.
Welcome.
Blessings upon your newborn.
Thank you.
I would like to say about this thing, President Seagullhead, with all due respect, isn't he the living embodiment of poetic justice? I can't help feeling that.
Yes, it's karma. It's karma, isn't it?
It's very much so. And I must respect the patience of Biden that he isn't, I know in my...
Don't mistake
it from the dung heap, so to speak.
Shamil, don't mistake it for patience or serenity. It's senility. He's not patient. He's not serene. He is one step away from Ward 5 and hospitalization. And I speak as someone who could not possibly vote for either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. I don't have a candidate running, unfortunately. But I certainly could never, ever agree to the idea of voting for the lesser of two evils, for the reasons I gave in my short that you've just watched. If you vote for the lesser of two evils, evil always wins. And it presupposes you can pick which is the lesser of those two evils. And between those two, I cannot. Last word to you, Shamil.
Yes, I stand corrected, and I have to agree. You're absolutely correct. So I don't think there's much more on that. I wish that you would perhaps give my respect to Richard Gage, truly one of the unsung heroes of modern times.
Well, I'm looking forward very much to speaking with him. And that'll be on the first Moats Extra, a week on Wednesday. That's Wednesday the 14th. I hope you'll join us, Shamil. I hope so. It should be a cracker. And Sirius says, in response to Trump's COVID diagnosis, it's a show, a well-planned PR campaign before the elections, especially after the debate was not as clear as he had hoped it would be. I think his PR people may have thought it's a good idea to show vulnerability, but show strength and care about all people, and his 4-minute speech on top. I'm with Anya on this. The medical staff at Walter Reed would not be a party to a hoax. And that's what that would be, Sirius. Joanne says Trump is a showman. He will make a miraculous recovery and explain that COVID-19 was not a big deal. And Ali says, is it a lie? Come on. Do you even need to ask that question? I do indeed. And Rob says, so Trump faked all those COVID-19 transfers to his wife, to Christie, to the senators, etc. Quite so. And Anne says he will crow about how tough he was against the virus. Maybe so. Joe Biden won the first debate, says Tom, but he will lose the next two. And once again, Trump will win the race to rule for another 4 years. Well, not if the polls are correct, Tom. They're not always, and of course they weren't last time. But there's not a single poll in America, in a swing state, or across the country as a whole that puts Trump ahead of Biden. That may not be what you want to hear, but it is a fact. And Rich says, oh no, not hearing about Trump again. There must be other news in the world. There is, Rich. There's a war that is raging that threatens to drag us into World War III, and we will be talking about it right after the news. And Stephen says Team Trump could create world peace and end all hunger, and some would still have something negative to say about him. It's a sick world in 2020. Well, I'll tell you what, Stephen, let him actually create world peace and end all hunger, and I will kiss his shoes. Mary says Trump did create Medicare for people infected with COVID. And Terry says, I agree, George, yes, Joe Biden is a puppet. And if he does win, Harris is lined up to take over from him within a year. It's all sorted in advance. In fact, I sometimes think it would be within a week. And Patrick says, I reject both Trump and Biden and vote for third parties, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's get the 8 o'clock news with my good friend, Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
US President Donald Trump could be discharged from hospital as soon as Monday as he continues to recover from coronavirus, his doctors have said. Mr. Trump has been fever-free since Friday and is not complaining of any shortness of breath, according to Dr. Sean Connolly, who spoke to reporters outside of the Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland today. He is now on dose 2 of 5 of the experimental antiviral drug remdesivir and is not experiencing any side effects. The US president said in a video on Saturday that he was starting to feel good and was looking forward to finishing up the election campaign the way it was started. The 4-minute video came a day after contradictory messages from his staff and medical team about his health being diagnosed with the coronavirus on Thursday night. The 74-year-old is considered to be at higher risk of serious complications from the virus due to his age, the outcome of his recent physical tests, and the fact that he is obese. As of Sunday morning, more than 7.4 million people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 200,000 have died. 65% of voters think the president would have avoided contracting COVID-19 if he took the virus seriously, according to a poll. The same poll suggests that his Democratic rival Joe Biden has taken a 10-point lead in the presidential race. Of the 1,005 people who responded to an opinion poll conducted by Reuters and Ipsos, 9 in 10 Democrats and 5 in 10 Republicans agreed with this statement. The poll suggests his illness has not widened his support, with Democratic rival Joe Biden making his largest lead in a month in the presidential race. The national opinion poll taken on the 2nd and 3rd of October suggested 51% are backing Mr. Biden, while 41% say they plan to vote for Mr. Trump. Another 4% say they are choosing a third-party candidate, and a further 4% said they were undecided. The coronavirus pandemic will be bumpy through to Christmas and potentially beyond that, Boris Johnson has warned, as he said it's too early to say whether local lockdowns are working. The Prime Minister acknowledged that there will be some members of the public who are furious at him and at the government amid the continuing COVID-19 restrictions. Speaking to the BBC's Andrew Marr, Mr. Johnson said the government was working flat out to allow for an easing of coronavirus restrictions in time for the festive period. But he again cautioned, being no doubt that it is still very possible that there are bumpy months ahead. He also rejected suggestions that he was still feeling the effects of coronavirus, which left him in intensive care back in April, or suffering from long COVID. He said, "This is total tittle-tattle, it's drivel. It is not tittle-tattle, it's balderdash and nonsense." Azerbaijan's second largest city, Ganja, has been shelled by Armenian forces as heavy clashes continue over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh enclave. The enclave is officially part of Azerbaijan but run by ethnic Armenians. The self-proclaimed authorities there said they hit Ganja's military airport after Azerbaijani forces shelled the region's capital. Azerbaijan says no Ganja military sites were hit. More than 220 people have died since the clashes began a week ago. There are fears that the actual death toll among the militaries from all sides, as well as civilians, could be much higher, as casualty claims have not been independently verified. Azerbaijan's military says its forces have retaken control of 7 villages since last Sunday, while Nagorno-Karabakh says its troops have improved their frontline positions. Earlier this week, Armenians said it stood ready to engage with mediators from France, Russia and the US to try to agree a ceasefire. Azerbaijan, which is openly backed by Turkey, has demanded the withdrawal of Armenian troops from Nagorno-Karabakh and adjacent areas seized by the ethnic Armenian troops. A further 12,872 lab-confirmed cases of the coronavirus have been reported in the UK, according to government figures. The figure, which was recorded as of 9 a.m. on Sunday, brings the total number of confirmed cases to 480,017. But a technical glitch may mean that actual daily figure is somewhat smaller. The government said that due to a technical issue, there had been a delay in publishing a number of cases in England, meaning the total reported over the coming days will include some additional cases from the period between the 24th of September and the 1st of October. The technical issue has now been fixed, they added, but it's not clear how much of Saturday's figure was from this previous period. Around 1,000 firefighters and troops are searching for missing people as floods hit France and Italy. A huge search and rescue operation has been mobilised in France to help search for at least 8 people still missing in a mountainous southeastern region after devastating floods that killed 2 people in neighbouring Italy. Floods washed away houses and destroyed roads and bridges surrounding the city of Nice on the French Riviera after almost a year's average rainfall in less than 12 hours. The missing people include 2 firefighters whose vehicle was carried away by a torrent when a road collapsed south of the village of Saint-Martin-Vesuvius. Thousands of demonstrators in Germany have protested against coronavirus restrictions. Counter-demonstrators also turned up in their thousands in Constance, southern Germany, to show support for the government's measures to contain the virus. Between 10 and 11,000 people took part in the different demonstrations across the weekend, and organisers of the protests against restrictions had hoped that more than 200,000 people would attend so that they could make a human chain around Lake Constance on the border with Austria. The counter-protesters formed a peace chain around part of the lake. Home Secretary Priti Patel has pledged to fix what she called the fundamentally broken asylum system in the UK to make it firm and fair. Speaking at the Conservative Party conference, he promised to introduce legislation next year for the biggest overhaul of the system in decades. And she said those against her plans were defending the indefensible. It comes after it emerged this week that the UK considered sending asylum seekers to an island in the Atlantic. Mrs Patel said changes would take time and she would accelerate the UK's operational response to the issue in the meantime. Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds said Ms Patel's comments were more evidence of how lacking in compassion and competence the Conservatives are. And finally, 5 foul-mouthed parrots have had to be separated after encouraging each other to swear at Lincolnshire Zoo. The parrots, named Billy, Eric, Tyson, Jade and Elsie, joined Lincolnshire Wildlife Centre's colony of 200 grey parrots in August, but it did not take them long to ruffle a few feathers with their foul language. We saw it very quickly. We are quite used to the parrot swearing, but we've never had 5 at the same time, Steve Nichols, CEO of the Wildlife Park, said. The parrots have been distributed to different areas of the park so they don't set each other off. Mr Nichols explained that nobody had complained about the parrots, but they were separated for the sake of young visitors in the hopes that they would pick up natural calls from the other African grey parrots. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Well, look, I just watched that 4-minute video of Donald Trump in, presumably, the Walter Reed Hospital, transformed to look like the Oval Office. And he looks better, by the way, without a tie. He looked well in that open neck shirt. And his face looked nice and pink. And he was not remotely short of breath, and he never coughed once. So there's only 3 conclusions that I can possibly reach. Either he doesn't have coronavirus at all, or this Regeneron cocktail of antibody cocktail that he's been treated with should be made available to the entire suffering masses of the world, because it is clearly a miracle. And the third possibility is that Donald Trump is actually Superman. He came down in Kansas in a cornfield some 70 years ago when Joe Biden had already been in the Senate for 100 years. All of these things are possible. Now, there's a war raging. The second biggest city in Azerbaijan, according to the Azerbaijan authorities, has been struck by shell fire from Armenian forces. Now, this is a possibility if they mean Nagorno-Karabakh, the enclave that I spoke of earlier, but it doesn't mean Armenia fired on Azerbaijan, because if it did, that would be further escalation of what has become a terrifyingly dangerous conflagration. And not the first in that area. The Soviet Union's collapse led to the lifting of many stones under which the serpents of separatism and sectarianism and strife had been lurking all along. You see, I told you this. Not everyone agrees, probably including my next guest, and certainly RT. But I told you that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. And one of the reasons why is that all of these deep and ancient hatreds would quickly re-emerge from under those rocks that they had been covered by during the Soviet period. That's just my theory, although I think I'll test it in a poll in the final part of the show. But this war contains within it the danger of world war. Turkey versus Russia is world war. Turkey is a member of NATO. Russia is a guarantor of the security of Armenia. We better hear from the expert, the intrepid and star reporter for RT, Murad Gazdiev, who joins me now. Murad, thank you for doing so. Bring us up to date with the battlefield situation first, if you would, and then we'll go back to the origins of all of this. You'll have heard the reports, you may even have delivered them, that according to the Azeri authorities, the second biggest city has come under fire from Armenian forces. Can you shed any light on that?
Hello, George. Well, today has been dreadful, honestly terrible as things stand. The 8th day of conflict, of outright war today, and there was a dramatic escalation. So previously, during the past week, we've seen huge battles, potentially hundreds, regardless of what both sides are saying. Potentially hundreds and hundreds of soldiers killed or wounded. You know, it has been terrible. Some of the weapons being used smash multiple rocket launcher systems. Both sides are utilizing, throwing almost everything they have into combat. The only thing that they haven't used yet are short-range ballistic missiles, which both sides have plenty of. The Azerbaijanis have Tochka-U systems, Soviet design. The Armenians have Iskander. Perhaps you've heard of them. Very recent Russian short-range, again, ballistic missiles. Thankfully, those haven't been used yet. But what we've seen today is there's been a dramatic shift in combat away from the front lines and, unfortunately, towards cities. So over the last several days, the Azerbaijanis have, and we've seen this, our correspondents have been caught in this. Igor Zhdanov, poor Igor Zhdanov, our colleague, forced to hide in a basement. To hide from Azerbaijani bombs, cluster bombs, cluster munitions. We have verified this. We have this on video. You might have seen it yourself. Cluster bombs are being dropped on Stepanakert, which is a city in Karabakh, autonomous. So these are the guys that broke away from Azerbaijan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, populated by Armenians, historic Armenian land, as they say, but claimed by Azerbaijan. Karabakh is where this entire conflict, what it's over. And the Azerbaijanis saying that they will take it back. Unfortunately, one of the ways they seem to have decided to take it back is by bombing the biggest city there, Stepanakert, where all these members of the international press were. And most members of the international press have been forced to evacuate today, driven out of Stepanakert by the local authorities because it's simply too dangerous. Now, cluster bombs falling on the area, on the city, into other villages, other towns. And when they started a few days ago, the Armenians, they swore, and Karabakh authorities, they swore to respond in kind, in an equally powerful show. And obviously, what their response was is what we saw today. The city of Ganja, Azerbaijani city this time, being targeted by multiple rocket launcher systems. Apparently, they were targeting an air base The Azerbaijanis say that it wasn't an airbase that was targeted. Everything was fine there, and that it was civilian populated areas that were targeted. 4 people dead, dozens and dozens wounded on the Azerbaijani side. In Stepanakert just today, during the bombardment today, 4 people dead, about a dozen wounded. So you know, this is an exchange, an escalation to meet, to respond to an escalation. The Karabakh side have said that this was just a one-time thing, that what they did attacking the city, the second largest city, as you mentioned, in Azerbaijan, was a warning to the Azerbaijanis to come to their senses, to pull back and to stop before things get out of hand, before they reach the point of no return. But you know, everywhere else in the front lines, where in less populated areas, thankfully, combat has raged. It is honestly, we're seeing every few hours new videos emerging, new videos of drone strikes, of masses of soldiers being wounded, being injured, being killed, of piles of dead bodies. So indeed, today has been the 8th day, and so far, perhaps the most tense.
Set the scene for the audience, not all of whom are even old enough to remember and may not have the grasp on what the origins of this conflict are.
Right, well, as you mentioned, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin, I mentioned last time we were talking, Vladimir Putin once called the collapse of the Soviet Union the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of this century. And what he meant wasn't that the Soviet Union was a nice place. It wasn't. I can tell you it wasn't. Coming from a nationality myself that was exiled, an entire nation exiled. Half my people less than a century ago were killed by Stalin. Just an executive order. The Soviet Union wasn't a nice place. However, the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, it drew arbitrary borders. So during the period of the Soviet Union, nobody really cared about who lived where. You know, they drew maps based on what was bureaucratically comfortable, nice for them. Nobody had any idea, nobody predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse. So when it did, as it does, suddenly people found themselves living in countries that they wanted no part of. In countries that they never belonged to, entire swaths, geographical areas. And one of such areas was Nagorno-Karabakh, where all of this is now happening, over which all of this was now happening. Historically, it was predominantly lived with by Armenians. So it was Armenians, populated by Armenians. Suddenly they found themselves in Azerbaijan. Armenians Christian, Azerbaijanis Shia Muslim, and things escalated from there. Azerbaijanis settled in this land and they lived there. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously tensions rose and wars broke out, as they did across the periphery of the Soviet Union, in Chechnya and other places. Eventually, the Karabakh side forced out the Armenians, and it wasn't pleasant. It wasn't nice. Just for the sake of balance, I will say that they evicted all the Azerbaijanis living there. Pretty much only Armenians in the area. So that's how it collapsed. There was a dreadful war. There was a UN resolution calling that ended the first war, that ended the conflict, forced the two sides apart, forced them to stop firing. The UN resolution recognized this area as Azerbaijani land. So internationally, it is recognized as Azerbaijani land. And what Azerbaijan is saying now is that, 30 years of negotiations, we're tired. This has led nowhere. All these countries are only interested in a ceasefire, maintaining the status quo, and we'll never get our land back as things stand. So what they've said in the past few days is this military operation is the only way to get this land back. Either that or the Armenians and the Karabakh side, they withdraw, they go back to Armenia and leave this land to us. And this is where we stand now. There's no hint of any negotiation on the horizon. So far, what we've seen is an ever-escalating conflict that is claiming more and more lives, and that is moving to cities, to towns, to civilian populated areas, as both sides, respond to an escalation after escalation.
So will it succeed? It seems to me unlikely short of the genocide, which would not be permitted by regional powers, maybe by all the world powers, after what happened a century or more ago to the Armenian people. No one would tolerate the physical annihilation of the Armenian people living in Nagorno-Karabakh. So how does this conflict end from the Azerbaijani standpoint? What are their war aims and how realistic are they?
Well, look at it this way: the Azerbaijanis, they aren't monsters. They've President Aliyev in a speech today. He also mentioned that the Armenians living there are welcome to stay. That they'd lived there before and that they could live very well side by side with Azerbaijanis. This is what he said in a speech today. So they are planning, or they're saying they're not planning on evicting everyone. The Armenians, on the other hand, they'd heard this before. And they believe that what they are fighting for in Karabakh is their very lives. They believe that if they lose Karabakh, a new genocide could well be in the plans and the works. I must say, the amount of propaganda coming from both sides is tremendous. The amount of fake news, fake stories, disinformation, it is absolutely tremendous and perhaps predictable. This was going to happen. Both sides completely refused to understand the other side, both sides maintaining that their position is right and just and good, and that the other guys are awful and evil and plan to kill them all. This is a very black and white conflict, and it isn't held, of course, by President Macron. He said that Turkey should stop with its rhetoric, that it is only egging Azerbaijan on to resolve a conflict that cannot be solved by force of arms. He is egging Azerbaijan on to try and do that. And, the further it goes along, the uglier it gets. Azerbaijan is obviously hoping that with its tremendous wealth, it is much, much richer, much more populous than 10 million Azerbaijanis, 3 million Armenians, and with assistance from Turkey. They're hoping that they can force this through, that they can, using force of arms, using all these drones and new equipment that they've brought from Turkey and Israel, that they can win on the field in battle, and that they can sort of skip all the diplomacy and the talks, the negotiations, as they said, that have dragged on for 30 years. The Armenians, on the other hand, desperate to prevent that from happening.
Macron denounced what he said was clear evidence of Syrian jihadists being rushed to the front, presumably through Turkish agency, to fight on the Azerbaijan side. But the problem with that is that the same President Macron, and indeed the British government and the US government, has been supporting these very jihadists in Syria. A bit of double standard there.
Well, I'd like to say supporting as in past tense, because a few years ago, when it became apparent that jihadists had taken over the entire opposition movement, the armies of the rebels in Syria were basically ruled by jihadists, dominated by them. That is not to say there weren't a few, very few, but there were moderate groups. At that point, Western nations, especially the United States, they drastically cut support for rebels. And ever since then, the burden of arming them, of paying them, of supplying an army that had essentially failed in its task, and its task was to depose of Assad, to take over Syria. When they had failed, it was all up to Turkey. So Turkey was financing thousands and thousands of hardcore jihadist fighters that had failed in their initial mission. So Turkey, wanted a return on its investment. It sent them to Libya to fight in Libya for Turkish interests there. It has sent them now, and as a fact, the proof is absolutely overwhelming. Russian intelligence, American intelligence, French intelligence, all agreeing on the fact that these fighters were there. Journalists from Sky News, The Guardian, the BBC, press all over the world, Al Jazeera even, having interviews, recording details of those who had, of their relatives, of the fighters' relatives, of the fighters themselves, who had gone to Azerbaijan. We now have video of them geolocated to the town of Hormuz, right near the border with Iran. And I want to mention here specifically, today Iran has mobilized troops and tanks and moved them to the border with Armenia and Azerbaijan, where the fighting is taking place, to the border of Karabakh, after 30-odd shells had landed on Iranian soil, after Iran had been forced to evacuate villages on the border with Armenia, Azerbaijan, where all this fighting is taking place. And we're in a situation now where Iran, you may remember, devoted forces to fighting these Syrian jihadists, to helping Assad fight them, combat them. We're now in a situation where Turkey has moved these jihadists from Syria to the border with Iran. So you can appreciate the sort of geopolitical tensions goes to show that Turkey has a vested interest in what is happening, in Azerbaijan succeeding.
Well, look, finally,
and getting Karabakh back.
Finally, Murad, the unspoken elephant in the room here is that if this escalates and escalates, Russia will be forced to come to the defense of Armenia, because it is not just honor bound to, but legally bound to. It has a signed agreement with Armenia. And if Turkey is increasingly inseparable from the Azerbaijan war effort, this posits a conflict between Russia and a NATO member, Turkey. Doesn't get much more dangerous than that.
Well, to start off, I would just like to say about my earlier answer, it is worth understanding the Turkish Azerbaijan share the same culture, the same language, the same, plus or minus the same mentality. They are a brotherly nation. There's a phrase in Russian, a brotherly nation. So if, for example, somebody attacked Austria, right? Germany wouldn't stand by. Germany would assist them. And in the same way, the Turks see Azerbaijan, a brotherly nation that they can't very well leave them to fend for themselves, to fight for themselves, even if they started this conflict themselves. So it is worth mentioning that Turkey isn't going to leave them alone. But then that creates a lot of regional problems. Because obviously, as you said, Russia and Armenia, they have a defensive pact, which can be triggered very easily. And what we have seen today is a huge escalation on the geopolitical arena. Because after all these strikes against the city of Ganja, Azerbaijani authorities came out and they said, we blame Armenia for this, not Karabakh, but Armenia proper. And from now on, if another populated area is struck by units that we believe are stationed in Armenia, we will fire into Armenia. And that is already reason enough to trigger the defensive pact with Russia. So you can appreciate the sheer, how tense and how problematic it is now. Of course, what is going on through everyone's minds in Russia, in Turkey, in Europe, this is potentially a regional war. Is Karabakh worth it? This may sound cold and heartless, but ultimately there's much more at stake. There's much more at risk. Is Karabakh worth it? And that is why we have leaders from all over the world rushing, tripping over each other. Merkel, Macron, Putin, everyone calling the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia and begging them, please stop, please de-escalate. And that is the huge worry, because when push comes to shove, there's reputations at stake. There's everything at stake. And my fear, and from my experience, is it'll take a lot to pull everyone back from the edge of the abyss.
Wow. Murad Gazdiev of RT, stay safe in that zone where you are. Thanks for joining us on board the mother of all talk shows. I better take a 60-second break after that.
In 2019, it was freed from the shackles of oppression and was unleashed on the airwaves on Sunday nights. Hard-hitting, head-cracking, record-breaking. The mother of all talk shows. A behemoth of broadcasting. A show so popular we could no longer contain it. It needed one more night. You asked for it, and now you're gonna get it. Wednesday nights. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough against the reigning, defending, undisputed heavyweight champion of the airwaves, Double GG himself, Moats Extra, George Galloway. Bare knuckle. Wednesday nights just got a whole lot wilder.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
That was the week that was. This is where I look back at what happened in history during the 7 days around about this date. On this day in 1957, yay, a Russian satellite, a Soviet satellite. Why can't you speak the word? Didn't it speak its name? A Soviet satellite launched into space. It was the first man-made object ever to leave the Earth's atmosphere. The Sputnik went into orbit 560 miles. That's 900 kilometers above the Earth, circling every hour and a half. Sputnik 2 was launched in November 1957 with a passenger aboard, a dog called Laika. The flight allowed Russian scientists to learn much about the prospects for human space travel. It didn't work out too well for Laika, however, a sacrifice that had to be made. It was Black Hawk Down in 1993 in Somalia when 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down in a heavy firefight in the capital Mogadishu with 5 deaths. What was meant to be a 90-minute lightning assault by US troops to rescue survivors and carry away the dead turned into a 17-hour battle to escape the hostile city. The final toll was 18 Americans and a United Nations Malaysian soldier dead and around 90 wounded. The Troubles, as we came to know them, in the north of Ireland officially began on October 5 in 1968, when a civil rights march in Derry ended in violent confrontations between police and demonstrators. At least 30 people were injured by police batons. It was followed by 2 more days of serious violence in Derry. The Troubles crossed the sea in 1974 when 5 people were killed and more than 50 injured in 2 explosions blamed on the IRA in the British garrison town of Guildford, southern England. Bombs went off in 2 pubs packed with Saturday night revellers. Many of the victims were soldiers back from duty in Northern Ireland. In 1975, 3 men and a young woman were convicted of the bombings and given life sentences. An appeal in 1977 was launched but rejected. But in 1987, their case was reopened after new evidence was presented. On the 18th of October, 1989, the convictions of the so-called Guildford Four were quashed and described as a gross miscarriage of Justice by the Court of Appeal. They had spent 14 years in jail. This was the week in 1981 when President Anwar Sadat of Egypt was assassinated by gunmen who opened fire as he watched a display at a military parade. A number of other dignitaries, including foreign diplomats, were killed or seriously wounded. Sadat was the first Arab leader to recognize the State of Israel since its creation in 1948. And it was on the 6th of October that in 1986 that Israeli nuclear scientist Mordechai Vanunu went missing after appearing in London, having revealed details of Israel's secret nuclear weapons program. It was later confirmed that he'd been befriended in London by an American Mossad agent, Cheryl Bentov, who was masquerading as an American tourist called Cindy. She lured him in a honey trap to Rome, and once there he was kidnapped and drugged and returned to Israel on a freighter. He was found guilty of treason and served 18 years in prison and still isn't allowed to leave the country. Earlier in 1973, heavy fighting erupted between the Arab and Israeli forces along two fronts. Most hostilities ended on the 22nd of October. Both sides suffered heavy losses. An estimated 8,500 Syrian and Egyptian soldiers died, while Israel lost about 6,000. And in 2000, Slobodan Milosevic, president of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, resigned following mounting pressure to quit over allegations of vote rigging. It was the week in 2001 when the United States launched its military offensive against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. The strikes were the first, but not the last, retaliatory response to the 9/11 terror attacks a month earlier, in which nearly 3,000 people died. On the 8th of October in 2003, The Terminator took California when the film star Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor of California, ousting the incumbent Gray Davis 3 years before his term was due to end. It's the first time in the state's history that a governor has been sacked mid-term. Hasta la vista, baby. The Conservatives were re-elected for a third successive term in Britain in 1959 with a huge majority. It was a personal victory for Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, known as Super Mac, who was leading the party in a general election for the first time. And also on October 9th in 1967, the revolutionary hero Ernesto Che Guevara was allegedly killed during a battle between army troops and guerrillas in the Bolivian jungle. It turned out, of course, that he had been captured in battle and summarily murdered. A post-mortem examination on his body, carried out 2 days later, proved that he hadn't been killed in battle. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and his remains were not found until June of 1997, when they were returned to Cuba. Following his death, Guevara became a hero of not just third world socialist revolutionary movements, but people like me and many in the Western world, and he remains so to this day. I have a fine collection of his photographs and came to interview his daughter, Dr. Aleda Guevara, for Sputnik on RT, worth watching on YouTube. And in 1975, on the 10th of October, film stars Liz Taylor and Richard Burton married for the second time, but who was counting? How do you get married for the second? You marry, divorce, you get married again. This one didn't last much longer, though, than the first one. The couple began rowing and separated in February of 1976. So that's not even 6 months. Richard Burton allegedly began drinking again. And it was this week, in 1980, when the late Margaret Thatcher made a defiant speech to Conservatives at the party conference in Brighton. In it, the Prime Minister stressed her determination to stick to the economic policies which had closed mines and thrown tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people onto the dole queues. She said, "To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The lady's not for turning." Well, she must be spinning in her grave at the way her successors have thrown hundreds of billions of pounds into relief measures in this pandemic. She wouldn't have held with that at all. So it was another seismic 7 days that helped shape the world, for good or ill, that we're living in today. I've got a call from Mexico City. I don't know that's ever happened before. Jack, in Mexico City, go ahead.
Hello, here is Jack, and I want to talk about the election in the United States and the importance of Mexico Day. Because you remember when Trump was elected, he came here to Mexico invited by the former president, that not the so president of Mexico. And now I think we have the pride of being the first nation that intervened in the U.S. election nowadays, that Russia and all the other countries intervene in that matter.
Jack, that was a poor line. I'm sure a great call. I hope the people at home heard it. I didn't, so I can't really respond to you. You'll have to forgive me. Michael is in Minneapolis on American politics. Michael, go ahead, please.
Hey, George, I just signed up for your Patreon, so thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right, so I feel like I have a question for you, and I want to lead up to it by saying that I feel like the last week of American politics has been sort of emblematic of the last several years. It used to be that the really intense, we had an entire debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And, Joe Biden sort of said, "Hey, Donald Trump, you haven't handled the pandemic well." And Trump said, "Yes, I have." But it was the most policy-free debate I've ever heard, in my lifetime of American politics. Neither one of them really addressed any of their proposed solutions during, the most devastating time in this country since
Well, Joe
the Great Depression.
Biden couldn't remember his, and Donald Trump doesn't have any.
Well, yeah, it's something like that. But I think what I want to kind of go to a point that you talked about with Anya Parampil, that I've sort of been shocked. In the United States, the really loony propaganda for most of my lifetime has been largely the province of the right wing, saying Obama was going to have death panels, or he was a secret Muslim who wasn't born in the United States, and all that kind of outlandish nonsense. But what's been alarming the last 4 years is how that sort of shifted, and now the the Republicans still have their crazy conspiracy, but a lot of my, educated, well-intentioned peers that I know who are, Democratic voters have sort of gone in. It started with sort of this Russia conspiracy and the idea that Trump was some kind of foreign agent, and then I'm looking at my, social media timeline this week, and George, you wouldn't believe the number of people that were convinced that Trump was faking an illness, which, for one, it'd be pretty hard to fake having COVID and going to a hospital. For another, that doesn't even make sense because it wouldn't help him politically. But, there's this idea that, Trump is such an out-of-control liar that everything he does is crazy. And yes, Trump is awful and he's a liar. Joe Biden's a liar too. As you know, he said he lied about his education and said he was arrested trying to see Nelson Mandela and all kinds of other...
Well, he lied, I think, that he'd been in the Senate for 180 years.
Yes,
I think that was probably a lie.
Yeah, but I guess that's definitely a lie, but I don't know if that's a lie of a man who's super coherent about his own existence. But I guess I'm not trying to get too far off the point. What I'm trying to ask you is, at a time that the greatest time of American crisis since the 1930s, you've got the voting segments of both major parties, Republicans and Democrats, essentially tilting at windmills like Don Quixote.
Yeah, exactly.
And nobody, everyone's so hung up on these crazy conspiracies that one can think about, actual policy and how to fix this country. So I guess my question for you is, where do you go from here in a country that's so heavily propagandized, where the citizenry has been turned against each other to such an alarming extent?
I wish I knew the answer to that, but it's a very good question. It is the question, because everything you say seems to me completely accurate. We have the Democrats apparently sincerely believing that Donald Trump may have been a Russian agent since 1987. In fact, therefore, a Soviet agent in 1987, becoming a Russian agent of President Yeltsin and then President Putin, and for all these years. The prominent Republicans literally have described Donald Trump catching the coronavirus as an assassination attempt by China on the President of the United States, as if it was China that told him to deny the existence of this virus, to refuse to wear a mask, to hold big rallies, to hold convocations on the White House lawn in which they all seem to have breathed coronavirus on each other. That's somehow China's fault. This level of unhinged madness is unprecedented in my long political lifetime. I've always thought America was slightly crazy, gun crazy. The idea of American exceptionalism is to the rest of the world completely crazy. But this is a level of madness never before seen. Since Caligula was destroying the Roman Empire, since Nero was fiddling while Rome burned, there has never been at the top of a major empire any madness quite like this. And how you get out of this, Michael, I really have no idea, but I would posit this. You will not get out of it under the duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats, who are demonstrably two cheeks of the same backside, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Two parties that are really one, just different sides of the same coin. That will not work, Michael. Last word to you.
I agree, George. I fear, I think the last time we had a level of political discourse in this country at this level, it was Al Smith versus Herbert Hoover, who were both pretty awful guys. So I fear for my country. I fear for my countrymen, and I'm really saddened and concerned about this sort of mental rot of this constant propaganda that's causing, all the people around me to hate each other in such an intense and sort of unhinged, unrealistic way.
Just finally, Michael, for your social media friends that doubt the seriousness of the contraction of the virus by the president, I would put it this way. If Trump comes out of hospital, as I have earlier advised him to do, and declares that he has undergone a Damascene conversion, like Saul of Tarsus, he has seen the light about the virus, about the healthcare system. If he comes out tomorrow, as he's reportedly going to do, and declares that he now sees everything differently, which to some extent Boris Johnson did, then that would be a reason to suspect that it had all been a setup. But it would also be, in my opinion, a political game changer. What say you?
I say that I've said the same thing I've said throughout this pandemic, that if either candidate embraces Medicare for all and a retroactive emergency UBI for an American people that's more impoverished than they've been in 80 years, that candidate will win in a landslide.
Great call, Michael.
Either one.
As always, in Minneapolis. Let's take a 60-second break and then on with more calls, shall we?
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Comrade, tired of being trapped in mainstream media? Join the revolution with mother of all talk shows. Has been instrumental in making brain and heart of people stronger, like kettlebell for mind. Don't be brainwashed, CC, an open mind to new way of thinking. If you don't know how, George will teach you. If you won't learn, he will make you. Speak to Comrade Galloway if you think you're hard enough on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Well, I'm waiting for a second poll, but the, I suppose, final result of the last poll was definitely a miracle recovery. 68% of you think that Donald Trump's going to make a miracle recovery. And that was probably before you even saw him on our news bulletin making a clearly miraculous recovery. Let's hear from Chris in Colchester on COVID-19. Chris, welcome back.
Hiya.
Hi.
Just one quick thing as well. When you had people like Ben Norton on last week about that story, I just wondered if you could put the link of his article into description on YouTube in future with situations like that, just so it's easier for people to get to.
Okay, I'm sure our people heard that. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Great. Like that story that you can see the massive propaganda campaign and stuff like the Integrity Initiative. Do you not realise that there's a massive propaganda campaign with COVID as well? There's a behavioural insights team working with SAGE that are changing the minds of the public intentionally. They boasted in 2010 about being able to do this in the Mindspace document. And the piece from one of their SAGE documents is, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. The perceived level of threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent using hard-hitting emotional messaging. So this is intentional. It's not all this confusion is part of their agenda. It's clear. It's always plausible deniability to say, oh, it's just incompetence. Boris Johnson is a moron, but there are people working behind the scenes that have some dodgy intentions.
Well, let's analyse that. Because some things are a conspiracy, it doesn't mean that everything's a conspiracy, and vice versa. Because something is being propagandized for by the government and the state, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. In 1940, the state was remorselessly propagandizing about the fact that Hitler was at the Channel Ports planning to invade us, and you had to cover up your light in the evening with a blackout curtain, and you had to go to an air raid shelter when the siren went, and you had to stop gossiping and spreading tales because careless talk cost lives, and you had to be on the lookout for fifth columnists and so on. So just because the state is propagandizing for something does not make the state wrong or that thing to be a bad thing. Just because the state has done bad things in the past doesn't mean that everything the state does is a bad thing. Now, you and I have a significant difference over the issue of the coronavirus. I have said earlier in the show, I'm sure you heard it, that the level of disinformation, misinformation, and simply confused information has now reached a stage where most people in Britain no longer know what they are supposed to be doing, what they are not allowed to do, no longer know why they're being asked to do what they're doing, and no longer know whether or not it is working. Now, which part of my proposition do you disagree with?
Comparing this to World War II or any other war, I mean, COVID is 24th on the list of killers in Britain today. So that propaganda just focusing on COVID. And you raised a good point to Dr. Brar last week, and he just completely ignored it, talking about all the other illnesses, cancers, heart disease, mental health.
He didn't ignore it. We talk about it all the time, but why isn't it comparable to the Second World War? After all, it has the capacity to kill far more of our people than died in the Second World War. It has well, don't do the maths, Chris. I know about the Second World War, and I know how many people we lost in it. So I know that it has the capacity to kill more of our people than were lost in the Second World War. But I know, because it's already happened, that coronavirus has killed more of our people than died in the Blitz. So the comparison is not fanciful. It's not an exaggeration. According to the Financial Times and according to the excess death figures, we have lost 75,000 excess people in Britain this year. It's hard to believe that that is not because of the coronavirus. You're one of the few who thinks there's no connection between these two things, but it's definitely more than we lost in the Blitz.
The excess deaths are through lockdown by the government. It has nothing to do with the virus. It's
has nothing to do with the virus. Do you want to stand by that? Do you want to stand by that statement, Chris?
Well, I'm talking about their actions of what killed people.
Chris, do you really want to stand by the statement that the 75,000 excess deaths have, quote, nothing to do with the virus, unquote?
Okay, not nothing, obviously, but I'm talking about their reaction. And we went to this lockdown based on the Imperial College saying 500,000 people would die of COVID. Complete garbage.
Could die. Well,
absolute garbage. Neil Ferguson.
Well, why is it garbage? 1 million people have already died of the coronavirus around the world. So why is it absolute garbage?
Neil Ferguson said up to 200 million people could die of bird flu. And it was like thousands.
No, I'm not talking about what Neil Ferguson said could happen. I'm talking about what has already happened. 1 million people are dead from the coronavirus in the world. Or are you denying that too?
No, I'm not denying that. But I just need to make the point that Sweden, he said that Sweden would have 100,000 deaths, and they've had under 6,000. So he's
why are you quoting someone that has nothing to do with me? I have nothing to do with this, Neil Ferguson. I'm putting my point to you. But let me play psychiatrist for a moment. I've got to, Chris, I'm sorry. Because you phone up here relentlessly every single week, making exactly the same points, with the same tone in your voice, and I'm wondering why. Why are you so obsessed with this?
With the virus?
With denying,
lockdown killing more people. Lockdown killed my dad. No, I'm not denying the virus. Lockdown killed my dad. And you get this same crazy doctor on. All he does is rant about China.
He's crazy.
That's crazy.
He's crazy.
That's crazy.
Our doctor is crazed. Okay, Chris, I think we've had enough. We've had enough from you. Here's the second poll of the evening. What caused the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh? A, Armenia, B, Azerbaijan, C, the breakup of the Soviet Union. So vote now on my Twitter feed, because I need to go now to the news with Jamie Lowe.
talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
US President Donald Trump could be discharged from hospital as soon as Monday as he continues to recover from coronavirus, his doctors have said. Mr. Trump has been fever-free since Friday and is not complaining of any shortness of breath, according to Dr. Sean Connolly, who spoke to reporters outside of the Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland today. He is now on dose 2 of 5 of the experimental antiviral drug remdesivir and is not experiencing any side effects. The US president said in a video on Saturday that he was starting to feel good and was looking forward to finishing up the election campaign the way it was started. The 4-minute video came a day after contradictory messages from his staff and medical team about his health being diagnosed with the coronavirus on Thursday night. The 74-year-old is considered to be at higher risk of serious complications from the virus due to his age, the outcome of his recent physical tests, and the fact that he is obese. As of Sunday morning, more than 7.4 million people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 200,000 have died. 65% of voters think the president would have avoided contracting COVID-19 if he took the virus seriously, according to a poll. The same poll suggests that his Democratic rival Joe Biden has taken a 10-point lead in the presidential race. Of the 1,005 people who responded to an opinion poll conducted by Reuters and Ipsos, 9 in 10 Democrats and 5 in 10 Republicans agreed with this statement. The poll suggests his illness has not widened his support, with Democratic rival Joe Biden making his largest lead in a month in the presidential race. The national opinion poll taken on the 2nd and 3rd of October suggested 51% are backing Mr. Biden, while 41% say they plan to vote for Mr. Trump. Another 4% say they are choosing a third-party candidate, and a further 4% said they were undecided. The coronavirus pandemic will be bumpy through to Christmas and potentially beyond that, Boris Johnson has warned, as he said it's too early to say whether local lockdowns are working. The Prime Minister acknowledged that there will be some members of the public who are furious at him and at the government amid the continuing COVID-19 restrictions. Speaking to the BBC's Andrew Marr, Mr. Johnson said the government was working flat out to allow for an easing of coronavirus restrictions in time for the festive period. But he again cautioned, being no doubt that it is still very possible that there are bumpy months ahead. He also rejected suggestions that he was still feeling the effects of coronavirus, which left him in intensive care back in April, or suffering from long COVID. He said, "This is total tittle-tattle, it's drivel. It is not tittle-tattle, it's balderdash and nonsense." Azerbaijan's second largest city, Ganja, has been shelled by Armenian forces as heavy clashes continue over the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh enclave. The enclave is officially part of Azerbaijan, but run by ethnic Armenians. The self-proclaimed authorities there said they hit Ganja's military airport after Azerbaijani forces shelled the region's capital. Azerbaijan says no Ganja military sites were hit. More than 220 people have died since the clashes began a week ago. There are fears that the actual death toll among the militaries from all sides, as well as civilians, could be much higher, as casualty claims have not been independently verified. Azerbaijan's military says its forces have retaken control of 7 villages since last Sunday, while Nagorno-Karabakh says its troops have improved their frontline positions. Earlier this week, Armenia said it stood ready to engage with mediators from France, Russia and the US to try to agree a ceasefire. Azerbaijan, which is openly backed by Turkey, has demanded the withdrawal of Armenian troops from Nagorno-Karabakh and adjacent areas seized by the ethnic Armenian troops. A further 12,872 lab-confirmed cases of the coronavirus have been reported in the UK, according to government figures. The figure, which was recorded as of 9 a.m. on Sunday, brings the total number of confirmed cases to 480,017. But a technical glitch may mean that actual daily figure is somewhat smaller. The government said that due to a technical issue, there had been a delay in publishing a number of cases in England. meaning the total reported over the coming days will include some additional cases from the period between the 24th of September and the 1st of October. The technical issue has now been fixed, they added, but it's not clear how much of Saturday's figure was from this previous period. Around 1,000 firefighters and troops are searching for missing people as floods hit France and Italy. A huge search and rescue operation has been mobilised in France to help search for at least 8 people still missing in a mountainous southeastern region after devastating floods that killed 2 people in neighbouring Italy. Floods washed away houses and destroyed roads and bridges surrounding the city of Nice on the French Riviera after almost a year's average rainfall in less than 12 hours. The missing people include 2 firefighters whose vehicle was carried away by a torrent when a road collapsed south of the village of Saint-Martin-Vesuvius. Thousands of demonstrators in Germany have protested against coronavirus restrictions. Counter-demonstrators also turned up in their thousands in Constance, southern Germany, to show support for the government's measures to contain the virus. Between 10 and 11,000 people took part in the different demonstrations across the weekend, and organisers of the protests against restrictions had hoped that more than 200,000 people would attend so that they could make a human chain around Lake Constance on the border with Austria. The counter-protesters formed a peace chain around part of the lake. Home Secretary Priti Patel has pledged to fix what she called the fundamentally broken asylum system in the UK to make it firm and fair. Speaking at the Conservative Party conference, he promised to introduce legislation next year for the biggest overhaul of the system in decades. And she said those against her plans were defending the indefensible. It comes after it emerged this week that the UK considered sending asylum seekers to an island in the Atlantic. Mrs Patel said changes would take time and she would accelerate the UK's operational response to the issue in the meantime. Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds said Miss Patel's comments were more evidence of how lacking in compassion and competence the Conservatives are. And finally, 5 foul-mouthed parrots have had to be separated after encouraging each other to swear at Lincolnshire Zoo. The parrots, named Billy, Eric, Tyson, Jade and Elsie, joined Lincolnshire Wildlife Centre's colony of 200 grey parrots in August, but it did not take them long to ruffle a few feathers with their foul language. We saw it very quickly. We are quite used to the parrot swearing, but we've never had 5 at the same time, Steve Nichols, CEO of the Wildlife Park, said. The parrots have been distributed to different areas of the park so they don't set each other off. Mr Nichols explained that nobody had complained about the parrots, but they were separated for the sake of young visitors in the hopes that they would pick up natural calls from the other African grey parrots. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Well, the coronavirus doesn't go away from the headlines, is now striking down politicians in the United States in potentially game-changing numbers, both for the presidential election, but also for the Senate race, for the nomination to the Supreme Court. The President and the First Lady have both been diagnosed positive with it. Trump looked great in that video, in which case he either never had it or he's made of pretty stern stuff. But the battle goes on, as you just heard in the argument, interminable it seems to me, between Chris in Colchester and I, the level of denial or the level of disbelief amongst the public of our government and our authorities, and therefore by extension, including our medical people, is high. I don't know if it's getting higher. They are extremely agitational and voluble. They listen, they call, they post, and they have made some high-profile recruitment. David Icke, Neil Clark, other people like that have a significant following have become zealots of that. Peter Hitchens become zealots of that cause. So the argument is still raging, hasn't gone away, despite the numbers having dramatically leapt this week. Slightly statistically misleadingly, because the numbers yesterday contained numbers that had not been counted and reported earlier when they should have been. But it's still a hell of a jump. 12,000 people and 49 dead people. That's a long way from the 1,000 a day that we were losing at the height of the epidemic, even though that was never acknowledged by the government, not once. But it now turns out that we were losing 1,000 people a day, dead, every day, for more than a week. And this was deliberately massaged, manipulated by the government to keep the number under 1,000, as if 900 and something wasn't bad enough. Now, look, there's breaking news. I'm just hearing that vaccinating all of the UK is, quote, not going to happen, unquote, according to the head of the vaccine task force, whoever that is. If a successful vaccine is found, only 30 million in the UK are likely to get the jab. This is being reported tonight by the UK's Financial Times. Kate Bingham is the head of the vaccination task force. So it's just as well that the Moats medic joins us, as always, on the line. Dr. Brar, thank you for that. Comment, if you would, on that breaking news. Quite startling, really.
Hi, George. A pleasure to be with you. That was, I think, quite a powerful and factual summary that you've given. The breaking news, in particular, that you asked me to comment in, is the fact that not the whole of the population
The whole population will not get it. Only 30 million are likely to get it, according to tomorrow morning's Financial Times.
I mean, in a way, this is principally speculative. There isn't a vaccine. Britain, so Kate Bingham, you talked about, the head of the vaccine program in Britain, have actually signed up for between 300 and 400 million doses from a number of different sources, from the main Western pharmaceutical companies. They you may not be aware, but they have not expressed any interest in the vaccines which have been granted a license, albeit during advanced phase 3 testing, such as the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. They've not shown interest in the Chinese vaccine. So none of those vaccines that they have bought or showed an interest in purchasing have proved yet safe and efficacious in their round 3 trials. None of them have been granted a license, and it looks increasingly like a long period of time before we're due to see any vaccination. So that's speculative. That said, if a vaccine was available right now, it would make sense to prioritize the most vulnerable sections of the population. We've commented before that the median age of the population is over 40 years of old. And we know that everyone over 40 years of old would be at much higher risk of ill effects were they to catch the virus than those younger than that age. So it certainly makes sense to prioritize those. And if you could vaccinate and immunize that group fully, it would be not unreasonable to not vaccinate the other half of the population
here's further and better particulars. No one under the age of 18 will get the vaccine. It's only for people over 50, as well as healthcare and care home workers. It will be aimed at those at risk, according to Kate Bingham. So you're saying, and I think you're right, in a situation of scarcity, these priorities would seem right.
I think so. I think that would make clinical sense. And indeed, if you find the people who are not keen to take an extra vaccination, they tend to be amongst the low-risk group. If you ask those who are in the higher risk group, they'd be much more keen and much more willing to take that vaccination, because they would be at far more risk. So the likely benefit to harm ratio, even with a minuscule adverse event rate, would be, it would make sense to target the at-risk group, George.
Let me press you on the statement you made, which, whilst undoubtedly true, is remarkable if you think about it. The Russian vaccine is being sent all over the world. I saw it the other day arriving in Venezuela, for example. It is doing extremely well. The reports from the front line of the vaccinations are very successful. But Britain has no interest in buying it, even trying it. It may even be impossible for the Russians to give it to me here in London. That's a complication that has arisen. Ditto the Chinese vaccine, ditto the Cuban vaccine. Indeed, I've been told, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the cocktail which Donald Trump was reportedly given was largely based on the work of China and Cuba in the cocktail that he took. What do you say?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have the specifics on the medication that Donald Trump's received, but you know, we commented very early on in the virus that China's response was so comprehensive. Their learning from the virus was very complete, and of course, they didn't wait for a vaccine. What I've stressed time and again, and I've heard an interesting call between you and Chris from Colchester, in which he says the lockdown simply wasn't necessary. But if you see what China did, China used very broad public health measures to eradicate the virus without a sniff of the vaccine or the vaccine being developable. They are still interested in the vaccine because, of course, if the majority and almost the entire Chinese population have not been exposed, as vast swathes of our own and the US and Brazil's and India's population have been exposed, China protected their population. They put the health of the people first. They protected their population from the virus through public health measures, through seeing where the virus was, testing, tracing, through isolating people who had the virus from the community, and therefore protecting the whole of the community and giving the best medical care possible to those with the virus. That is not the approach we've followed, and therefore we have failed to stop this from spreading, and now it is really endemic in our population, and the fact that it's endemic is being shown in this second spike. But it's certainly true and remarkable that, you know, that China's interested in developing the vaccine to protect their population, because as long as it becomes endemic in the world, there'll be the constant risk of reinfection from outside. So the world can't get back to normal entirely without also following this policy of protecting the vulnerable populations through vaccination. While it is endemic, and it already has become endemic basically in the world, in many in South America, in North America, in Europe in particular, in South Asia. You know, this virus is something that humanity is now going to live with for a long time as it goes through the population until we're able to protect the vulnerable. And the vulnerable won't be protected by getting the disease. The vulnerable will be exposed. If we can protect the vulnerable through vaccination, that's obviously to our benefit. And therefore, the Chinese are actively pursuing this, as are the Russians, as are many groups, you know, 170 groups, 180 groups around the world. The fact that we are not interested in the best candidates shows once again that the chief priorities of our government are the geopolitical, geostrategic, and financial interests of the most wealthy in our society rather than the health needs of the population. And we've seen that time and time again in different ways, but I think it's starkly illustrated by the fact that a vaccine has been developed, which they could show interest in, but don't, simply because they want to ensure that when this vaccine rolls out, and it's likely that a vaccine will roll out from several sources, they want to ensure that it's their vaccine that wins a battle of competition. So they are approaching this like shopkeepers, not like doctors. They're approaching it like, how can we ensure that our registers ring and collect the dollars of, and you know, which is the world currency still in pounds, associated with trying to protect a vast swathe of the world's population. And this is its chief strategic importance. And of course, they don't want to signal to the whole of the world that they are losing the technological and industrial race. The reason that in America, China has become such a key topic is that China is advancing and making these huge industrial and scientific strides forward, and therefore they're displacing the United States as the dominant power in the world. And the United States can't accept.
As perhaps they remember 1957, around about this week, when they were startled to their core by the first Sputnik, and now they can't bear Sputnik 5 to steal a march on them. It is worth recording that there are now more cases of coronavirus in the White House than there are in New Zealand, Vietnam, and Taiwan put together. But finally, Doctor, what's your take on this latest spike? How much of it is a statistical quirk, and how much of it is something that we should be extremely worried about?
I think that there are these cases. If you see, for example, certain periods, that there was one spike in deaths in the United States when there was suddenly 7,000 or 8,000 deaths in a single day, when it was realized a group of deaths were not being accurately recorded. So there are these isolated days where you have, a huge increase in numbers due to recording errors. But there's no doubt also that there was one figure from the Track and Trace app this week, or rather from the Case Tracker app, which suggested that perhaps the rate was flattening. But if you look at really many statistical markers, whether it's the hospital admission rates, which are really going up steeply, and we're seeing cases again in hospital. And I invite Chris from Colchester to go down to his local hospital in Colchester, look at the measures they have in place there, see that they're preparing for a second wave, and quiz any one of those medical doctors. I totally, feel for him that he may have lost his father during this time. I don't know the specifics of the case, but those people who think that they're losing people, not because of the virus, but because of the fact that the NHS is denied to them, or that other aspects of social service are denied to them. What they're really angry with is not the virus, it's not the absence of the virus, but what they're seeing is the effects that our NHS and our society have been actually overwhelmed because our government has been unable to make the correct measures to safeguard their health as well as look after this.
Not being able to chew gum and walk in a straight line at the same time. Doctor, we have callers who disagree with you and me on the line. If you'll forgive me, I'll take some of those while you're still with me. Shall I take line one, John in London? John, are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead, John, fire away. I'm not hearing that one. Line two, Michael in Croydon agrees with Chris and in Colchester. Michael, welcome.
Hi there. I'm actually in Clacton, but Stuart, I just don't think Chris explained very well. You're very dismissive of conspiracy theory. I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I try to keep on the common sense central line of conspiracy theory. What he was trying to ask or to question was not that there isn't a large amount of excess deaths, but we need more detail of the amount of deaths that are through heart attacks and we're not getting this.
I think that's a legitimate point, Michael, but I have to make a judgment. Do I believe the Britain's doctors, or do I believe Big Tam on Facebook? That's really the dichotomy that I face. Or do I believe Michael in Clacton or Chris in Colchester? Do I believe the massed ranks of dedicated National Health Service doctors, nurses, and professionals of all kinds? That's my problem, Michael. You obviously find it quite easy to disregard the views of the medical profession.
You're being ungenerous to me. You're putting me saying that I'm saying we need the proper figures. Doctors can't tell us. Politicians can't tell us.
Who can tell us then? Big Tam on Facebook.
We need science to tell us, and we're just not having the figures.
But the doctors are telling us. Let's hear from one of them. A doctor, a surgeon, a distinguished medical figure. Dr. Ranjeet, what do you say to Michael in Clacton?
I was wondering, Michael, whether you'd allow me to try and explain to you the significance of the excess death figure. Is he still there?
He's still there.
Let me basically explain. Average deaths. Average deaths from year to year are very similar in a similar population with similar characteristics, precisely because you can expect on an average year an average number of people to have similar conditions, whether that's colorectal cancer, whether that's a brain cancer, whether that's a cardiac event like a heart attack, whether it's a stroke, whether people are dying from particular degenerative diseases, whether they're getting Alzheimer's and pneumonia and dying. So if you look on a population-wide basis, these figures are remarkably similar. And therefore, the fact that during this pandemic, during the months of the pandemic, and very much tracking and relating to the numbers of infections and numbers of hospitalizations we're seeing with coronavirus, the fact that the average, so the excess deaths, more than normal, suddenly we're getting 2.5, 3 times the number of deaths you would expect to see in that period at the same time as this one new infection, is very clearly telling us that that is the cause of the underlying problem. Now, there are other issues. There absolutely are issues. And when people say there are real issues of isolation, of mental health, of withdrawal of facilities, withdrawal of care from the community, though with a lack of access for normal routine operations. Carol Sikora, a very right-wing Tory cancer professor, I think at Imperial, has been very vocal saying, the real problem is lack of access to healthcare. Now, he is a very strong advocate of privatization. He's very close to the Tory party. He has his own, private practice, massive private practice in cancer care to look after and think about. So it's all grist to his mill when he's able to say these things. Good for his personal practice. But what he's not pointing out, and what our politicians are not pointing out, is the fact that actually what we're seeing is the effect of undercapacity in our healthcare system. Not long ago, less than 20 years ago, we had double the number of beds in our NHS. If we had that number of beds, it would be quite possible. And we said from the very beginning of this, what we really need to do is have entirely separate units. The Chinese, when they published their document of how to deal with this virus, said you need a fever clinic. And they erected fever hospitals, entire hospitals that were dedicated to the care of patients with this single infectious disease. Just as in our history, you would see there were tuberculosis hospitals for dealing with that single infection, precisely because it's an infective agent that needs to be isolated from vulnerable communities. Our government didn't want to do that. It wanted herd immunity. It wanted the infection to spread, and we've seen the results of that. And that's a real number of deaths. It's a real toll upon our community. It's a real 75, 80,000 people who have already died, and this is far from over, I regret to say, Michael, and Chris, if he's still listening. So
let me go on. Thanks for that, Michael. David in Malaysia also thinks we're wrong. Let's give him a chance. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, George. Great show as usual.
Thank you, mate.
While I respect Ranjit's views, there are alternative views out there. I'm thinking about an article by Chris Snowden on Spike this week, saying that the lockdown really wasn't necessary. There are other authoritative voices like John Lee, professor of pathology, saying that the lockdown is doing more harm than good and wasn't necessary in the first place. So I just wish you'd have some balance, get some other people on, some other expertise on.
Well, first of all, you are balanced, and secondly, you're already hearing these people elsewhere. I have a point of view, and so does Ranjeet, and I agree with it. And that's why we have this conversation every week, and that's why people like you are invited to phone in and put your point of view. Make one more point, and then I'll go to Ranjeet. Go on, David.
Can you get some of those people on, though, George? I mean, I can't make the case as well as John Lee, who's a professor of pathology, or Chris Snowden.
Well, you've been persuaded by their case, so you must be able to at least summarize it.
Well, their case is logical. I mean, the argument that Chris Snowden makes about Sweden, comparing Sweden only to Norway and Denmark, is wrong. And the idea that it's to do with population density.
How will you feel?
He totally demolishes these arguments.
It doesn't totally demolish it. Apart from anything else, Sweden is now heading in the direction of the British response, and never was the laissez-faire Valhalla that those who've been worshipping its very name of late have been predicting. But Sweden is actually now moving in the direction that Britain is taking. David, I'll let you come back in after Ranjeet responds.
Absolutely, all of your point of view there, David. But it seems to me that you're essentially saying that lockdown is wrong. You think the virus is real, but lockdown is wrong. Now, again, if we look at the countries who dealt with this very successfully, they didn't all have a generalized lockdown. And I don't think Sweden is the best example. Sweden has had a lot of restrictive measures, but it has left them to a degree up to the population to enforce, and it's sought to persuade them by education, and it's not had so many restrictions in place. Sweden, I think, it's reasonable to compare Sweden to the other Scandinavian countries because they do have similar population characteristics, and actually their rate is much higher than those, and very similar, in fact, to our own rate in our own country. And our own country is not an example really of a place that has had, good targeted public health measures. We've failed to do so, and therefore the lockdown was a blip in the overall response, and the overall characteristic response in our country really has been a laissez-faire one with an occasional measure. And it was very clear. They actually said from the beginning, what we'll do is we'll wait for the infection to spread through the population. When it reaches the point that the NHS is being overwhelmed in terms of ITU bed capacity, this is their trigger. So when the ITU beds are full to the brim with COVID patients who can't be looked after, then that's their trigger for locking down, and they'll then let it run through the population and again and again and again. And they predict that there'll be several spikes. And they've been quite open, our government, in saying that's going to be their model. It's not a model of very clearly seeing where the virus is and restricting the virus from access to the rest of the population. And the countries which have done so very well, very successfully, without vaccines, without huge numbers of medical innovations, but using really basic public health measures, are those who have been able to mobilize the resources of their country, medical and economic, and put the lives of their people first. And our government and the United States government have palpably failed to do that.
David, last word to you.
But all I'm asking for is some alternative views, some alternative expertise views, not my views. I'm not an expert. But get John Lee on or get Chris Snowden on and get them to put the point.
Well, you're already listening to them and reading them elsewhere. Why should I mean, do you want me to put, I don't know, Francois or someone I profoundly disagree with on China? Look, let me think about it, David. I'll come back to you on that. Last call for you, Ranjeet. John in London is back, thinks the government is misleading us. Let's hear why. Go ahead, John.
Well, I don't know if they're misleading us at the moment, but what I will say is in the past, when you vote a government in...
Sorry, George, I don't know if you were hearing me, but I'm not hearing the call.
Okay,
can you hear me?
I can hear you, John, but Dr. Ranjeet cannot. But I will summarize to him what you tell me. So go ahead.
Okay. At the moment, when you get a government in power, certain governments will tell you one thing, another government will tell you another. So, we've been lied to in the past about certain things. We've been misled in the past by certain things. So is it any wonder why people in the United Kingdom is not taking any notice of what's happening at the moment?
It's no wonder at all. And in fact,
exactly.
You have no disagreement with me or with Dr. Ranjeet. We both are at the forefront of saying the reason that there is a crisis in government credibility, state credibility in Britain is because the state and the government, successive governments, actually the Labour government of Tony Blair, worst of all, have systematically and on a massive scale lied to the people. Ranjeet.
I couldn't agree more, George. I think this is absolutely. I think your caller is absolutely right. I didn't catch his name. I'm so sorry. I think he's absolutely right that the people of this country are fed up being lied to, and that the overwhelming, theme for me of this pandemic has been under the slogan of protecting the NHS. We've heard it every day. We've seen it everywhere. Actually, taking a sledgehammer to the NHS. The progressive privatization attacks have intensified during this pandemic to the extent, and particularly on the issues that have failed the most, on provision of PPE, huge spending to the private sector without delivery and no penalty for them. On the questions of track and trace and testing, huge spending to the cronies of this government, to the large finance capitalists who have failed to provide. Same on ventilators, failed to provide, taken money hand over fist, failed to provide without penalties, all the while running down the NHS's ability to use its clinical expertise and running down its facility constantly under a very false slogan of protecting the NHS. The NHS is being attacked during this pandemic, and that is the point that we need to get home again and again to the British public, who I do not think, under this hail of propaganda which issues from our government, fully understand the extent to which they're having the wool pulled over their eyes.
John, last word to you, sir.
What I'd like to say is you're getting the government to tell the people what to do, right? Now, when you go outside, which I have, driving my car, and you get stopped by a police officer, of all people, a police officer is supposed to follow the rules. But when you get a police officer come up to you and go, "Excuse me, but why don't you have a mask on?" "Oh, I'm very sorry, officer, but why don't you have a mask on?" You know, it's ridiculous. People are not listening to the government anymore because they're fed up. When something goes wrong in this country, when somebody messes up or scams the system, the benefit system, everybody has to suffer. Everybody has to go through the process. One person makes a mistake and we all have to suffer.
Okay, John, thanks for that. Lastly, Doctor, before I let you go, I projected the argument earlier that because nobody in their right mind anyway, is any longer confident that Boris Johnson can sail us through these difficult waters, that this too needs to be, if you like, privatized. We need a COVID czar, someone credible, someone who can speak to all sides in this debate, someone of weight to be in charge, obviously sackable if they fail, but be in charge, be the person with whom the buck stops. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's a nice idea, George. I've seen so many. I mean, when you say czar, I always think of Tony Blair's government. He was always promoting czars of one nature and another. The problem, of course, is that the overwhelming issue is not just one or other politician. The problem is the framework within which they're working. They're unable to do anything except more of the same. The entire framework of government is set up to fleece the people, I'm afraid, to run down the NHS, and without the power to turn around that entire direction of travel, it's unlikely that any one individual will be able to make the necessary policy changes unless we said we were going to scrap PFI, we were going to scrap the private farming out of testing, and all care would be provided in common through through the National Health Service, which should be fully nationalised, renationalised, the parts which have been privatised. If someone were able to champion that as an approach, then absolutely we could get the clinicians who have the relevant expertise across the country, and there are thousands and actually tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of them. We can mobilize them to really give the response that would make us as a nation proud and confident that we are actually dealing with what should be just an ordinary health contingency, but actually is the direct result of privatization, running down of our systems which are supposed to protect us. This is the inherent problem that we're having at present, George.
Dr. Ranjeet, thanks for staying extra long this evening. I appreciate it very much. Calls all the way to the end of the show, but after this 60-second break.
Oh, Johnny, how you can love.
Stop banging on the toilet door, Amber. Stop banging on the toilet door. You're gonna frighten the pilot. Anyway, I'll talk to you when we land. Although that could take a considerable amount of time.
Oh, Johnny.
news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Global higher education with one of the world's best-known iconoclasts. The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Now, Ollie asks, George, what do you think of the first episode of Spitting Image 2020? I haven't seen it, actually, although it's being done by a former workmate of mine and friend of mine, Matt Ford, a right-wing comedian, I think you could call him these days. He is a funny guy, but I haven't seen the show. I'll tell you next week. Nadia says the US has 7 million sick and 220,000 dead. We have 6% of the total world population and 25% of total world sickness. Nadia, you've also got 25% of the world's prison population. And maybe these two things are actually not unconnected. Let's hear from Dimitrios in Chicago. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Dimitrios.
Hi, George. I want to thank you. I've been watching you for many years on TV, especially when you were in front of Congress. It was wonderful to watch.
Thank you. It was a nice day,
I wanted to tell you that there's so many lies on YouTube, even on the liberal stations about China. So I on YouTube, I leave messages about China, what they're doing and how they're lying. But no matter, I get censored. And I've gotten censored. I've done it many times. I've spoken about Russia and China, and I get censored. Now they're getting rid of my subscriptions, and I can't even get through. I have a hard time getting to you. So I know they're watching me, but it's a shame that in my country that we can't even tell the truth about a wonderful country like China who wants to do work with us, who wants to be our friend. But I'm kind of worried about it because they seem to be kind of watching me. I get off the crazy things on the internet, and I know I'm not a goofy guy, but I'm worried.
Well, you're
about
certainly not
country.
censored here, Dimitrios. You're welcome anytime, and you're doing God's work if you are trying to counter the lies about China and Russia, and may God strengthen you. Brian is in Glasgow on COVID. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, George. I was just watching. It was really quite interesting, the debates there with Dr. Brar.
Yeah.
And I kept sort of on the conflagration between the reality there is a COVID-19 and the idea that, well, wait a minute, the response to it. And for me, corporate-wise, it's also what Dr. Brar talked on with NHS. He was saying not the problem with just one particular parliamentarian, but the way the system is. It's all being used as a front, whether it's for profiteering or to blame economic inevitabilities that were going to happen because of the structures. And for me, it's blatantly obvious. And I was also going to ask George if he saw, for me, what was the first real honest synopsis of Julian Assange prosecution, the young journalist that came out. You'll probably know who he was, but he was fantastic because he called it out for what it is.
Is that the one, the young man that was talking outside the Old Bailey?
Yeah.
Yeah, very powerful. That. Yeah, very, very good.
It was.
Brian, just because of the hour, I'm going to cut you short. Thanks for making those points. Eves is in Idaho. Go on, Eves.
Hello, George. Thank you to have me on. I just wanted to say, my son is an ICU. He has seen many COVID. He has intubated many COVID. And what he says, and I think it clarifies the situation between different people, is that what's important is to reduce the inoculum. That means the exposition to the virus. So this is why I think you have a disagreement about lockdown, because what he says is that in the situation of, if you take Italy, for instance, where people live in the same house and so on, if you lock down, you may be increasing the inoculum on the old people from the young people because everybody is locking down, nobody goes out, nobody has masks and so on. But they did reduce the propagation of the virus. So at the end of the day, he say what's important is to have a virtuous cycle going on where people stay away from each other, wear masks. At home, they don't wear masks, but they talk a little far away, and all this good behavior is at the end what makes somebody not so sick if he catches it. And that, I think, is very important to have this concept of inoculum.
Well, a virtuous circle would be a fine thing, and not just on the COVID. Thank you very much, Eve, and best of luck to your son, the ICU doctor. Gary says, if an SNP MP can flout the rules and endanger lives, why should anyone follow the narrative that COVID is the deadliest virus to the human race? Well, it's certainly the most infective in the air at the moment. And that gives me the opportunity, Gary, to draw attention to what is a quite extraordinary story that many people in other parts of the world may not be fully across. An SNP member of parliament, a separatist nationalist MP, she displayed symptoms, and she had to have symptoms or she wouldn't have got a test, and went for a coronavirus test. While she was waiting for the result of the test, but still suffering the symptoms, she visited a beauty parlor, a gym, even a police station to talk about the coronavirus with police officers, and then got on a train with symptoms from Glasgow to London, then went into the House of Commons with symptoms, rubbing shoulders at least with all the other MPs, all the other staff in the House of Commons, the police officers, the ladies that serve the tea and the dinners and so on. She went into the chamber of the House of Commons and spoke. And with every word, she was spitting coronavirus. How do I know that? Because she had by then received the result of her coronavirus test, which was positive. So this is a woman who now knows that she's got coronavirus, but goes into the chamber of the House of Commons, potentially infects everybody else in it, everybody else working in it, and then gets on a train for the 400-mile train journey from London to Glasgow with a positive coronavirus test in her pocket. Now, such a person is either too stupid to be a member of Parliament or too wicked to be a member of Parliament. And this woman, Ferrier, the SNP Member of Parliament for Rutherglen and Hamilton West, must resign, must step down from her parliamentary seat. It's not just me saying that. The leader of her own party is saying that. All of her parliamentary colleagues are saying that. The Speaker of the House of Commons is in a rage about this, and the Standards and Privileges Committee of Parliament will investigate her actions. And if they find that her conduct is so reprehensible, reckless, and dangerous that they are going to suspend her from the House for 10 days or more, then she will be subject to a recall petition in her constituency, where if 10% of her constituents, that's roughly 8,000 people, sign that recall petition, then she will be forced to step down and fight a by-election, which she would do not as a member of the Scottish Nationalists, because they have completely disavowed her. So I give her this notice now. It would be better for you to resign with some dignity, because it seems inconceivable that you will not be suspended for 10 days or more. And if you are, I will be on the streets of your constituency, collecting signatures to force you to stand down. It would be better by far if you did now the decent thing that you didn't do when you had that coronavirus symptoms, and then even worse when you had the coronavirus positive test. I hope you'll do it, Miss Ferrier. I hope you'll do it for Scotland. I hope you'll do it for your constituents. And frankly, I hope you'll do it for yourself. Now, as you probably heard earlier, but I hope you haven't forgotten, you can register now on my Patreon page. First 500 early birds get a bonus to reserve your seat for the Moats Extra, which begins a week on Wednesday, the 14th of October at 8 p.m. You can watch it on my Facebook page, and if you go to it now, you'll see an event post. You can register there and be sure of a seat at what I assure you will be George Galloway bare knuckle. It will be Moats bare knuckle. And the first week we will talk about 9/11 and conspiracy theories, perhaps more generally. So please do that before the end of this evening. Wynn is in Wisconsin on Armenia. Go ahead, Wynn.
Well, hello, Mr. Galloway. Thank you for this opportunity.
Welcome.
I'm calling to mention your characterization of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but especially as it pertains to Russia joining into the fray against Turkey, which means NATO. I think you are too pessimistic about it, because in reality, most of the Western, the NATO bloc, the EU, the US, their economies are in tatters post-COVID-19, and even their peoples are restless at home. So no sane Western leader would would rush to the rescue of President Erdogan.
But they're legally bound to under Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Any attack on Turkey is an attack on all the NATO members. That's a treaty obligation.
Perhaps you're correct, but how many times have legal treaties been broken? I mean, this is realpolitik. Do you think they want to spend money going to the aid of Turkey when you have a crazy guy like Erdogan there and risk a fury at home?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the points you make are powerful ones, but that hasn't stopped them steaming their navy into the South China Sea. It hasn't stopped them from ringing 400 military bases around China. It hasn't stopped them from their war games on the frontiers of Russia. It hasn't stopped them wrecking the treaties of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, now threatening the START nuclear treaty. None of this unrest at home and dislike of this or that member of NATO has stopped NATO from behaving in an entirely reckless way in these other places, Wynn.
You make a good point there, but, that was then. I mean, the analogy I can say was rule Britannia. Once upon a time, the British Navy ruled the seas. Likewise with NATO, the sun is setting on the Western empires, and China is moving ahead. So they can't afford it. And the bottom line is they can't afford it. I mean, with all this COVID and medical and other things that are going on in these economies, they just cannot afford this. And you'll see them cutting these bases in 5 years' time. And Trump wanted to do that because he saw the handwriting on the wall, but the deep state would not allow him.
Well, good points. I wish I was as sure as you are that these things follow logically and automatically. But we'll see when. Thanks for that wonderful call from Wisconsin. I need to ask you to leave the stage because there's a legend on the line. It's the legend, Norma, in Bristol. Always love to finish the show with you, Norma. What would you like to talk about this evening?
Well, it might seem a bit trivial, George, but I think, like Dr. Ranjeet said, this is a withdrawal of the NHS facilities. Now, I am deaf in my right ear. I've got the phone in my left ear. My surgery told me because of COVID, they won't syringe my ear, but I could go private, and it would cost £50 for one ear, and if it's both ears, £90.
Wow.
You know, some people could not afford that, and it's really bad, this deaf. My husband's a bit deaf as well, so we're just shouting at each other.
Are you deaf in the same ear?
Yeah, no, he's just deaf anyway. He's got a hearing aid, but he doesn't work it properly. But I mean, my point is this the direction that the NHS is going? Because it takes 5 minutes.
It's an absolute scandal. I mean, the scandal is twofold. That the NHS cannot provide a 5-minute task to clean an old dear's ear out and help her to hear better. And secondly, that it's £50 and £90 for both of them. Right. I could set up a stall in the high street and do it. 2 for the price of 1, Norma. It's an absolute scandal. And this is what Dr. Ranjeet is trying to portray. That we are ineluctably, it seems, on a path towards the Americanization of our health system, and the American political parties have turned their faces away from moving in a European or British direction as was. And that is a tragedy for both peoples. I believe in the National Health Service. Not uncritically, actually. It's got a lot of things wrong with it, and always has. I'm not one with stars in my eyes about the National Health Service. No. I have personal reason to be sure of the fact that the NHS is not always what it should be. But it's one heck of a lot better than having to pay each time you need your ear syringed. When you get to your venerable status as a legend of radio, you'd think they'd be honoured to syringe your ears. Fagash Flow is known throughout the land. Let me be clear about that. So Bristol NHS, I hope you're listening and that you'll put aside this foolish notion that you can demand £90 from Norma and others like her for the mere syringing of an ear. Thank you, Norma, for that call. Thank you, everyone, for their calls and emails and tweets. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Last week was as good as it gets, as good as it's ever been. 1.2 million viewers, plus listeners that we can't count on the internet, on FM and on AM. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back at the same time, same place, next week, and bring another viewer, bring another listener with you. I've been George Galloway. This has been the mother of all talk shows, and you have been a wonderful audience. By the way, most people blame the breakup of the Soviet Union for the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Clever people, our viewers and listeners. Good night.